The Gulf Coast of Mexico holds a secret that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Near the modern city of Veracruz, hidden beneath centuries of jungle growth, the Chempoala stone circles rise from earth that's been farmed, walked over, and largely ignored for generations. Most visitors to this region know about the Aztec temples, the Spanish conquest, the familiar narratives we've all heard before. But these circles, they predate all of that. We're looking at structures built somewhere between 1200 and 1519 AD, though recent excavations suggest the foundational work might reach back even further. The Totonac people, who controlled this region before the Aztecs arrived, left behind something remarkable here. Not pyramids, not palaces, stone circles arranged in patterns that seem to map something we haven't quite figured out yet. Each circle measures roughly 30 to 40 feet in diameter. The stones themselves aren't massive, nothing like Stonehenge, but their placement shows a precision that demands explanation. Stand in the center of one at dawn during the spring equinox, and the sun rises directly over a specific marker stone. Do the same during winter solstice, and a different stone frames the sunrise perfectly. The Totonacs never developed a written language we've been able to fully decode, so we're left reading their intentions through architecture alone. What we do know comes from Spanish chronicles, written decades after contact, and those accounts are problematic at best. The conquistadors weren't archaeologists. They were looking for gold, not understanding. But here's what makes Chempoala particularly intriguing. The circles aren't alone. Scattered throughout the complex are smaller stone arrangements, almost like satellites orbiting the main structures. Some align with the circles, others point toward geographic features miles away, specific mountains, river junctions, coastal landmarks. Local tradition, passed down through generations who've farmed this land, suggests these were ceremonial spaces, places where the community gathered during harvest times, where important decisions were made, where the living connected with ancestors. That makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't explain the astronomical precision. Modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed something unexpected beneath the visible circles. There's a network of stone channels, too regular to be natural, running between each formation. Some archaeologists think these carried water for rituals. Others believe they might have been acoustic channels, designed to carry sound in specific ways during ceremonies. Then there's the matter of the stones themselves. Geological analysis shows they didn't come from nearby. The nearest quarry matching their composition sits almost 12 miles to the west, across difficult terrain. Moving them would have required organization, planning, and a labor force working toward a shared goal we can only guess at. What's equally puzzling is what we haven't found. No evidence of permanent dwellings within the circle complex. No burial sites, no trash heaps or tool caches that would indicate people lived here day to day. Whatever happened at Chempoala's stone circles, it wasn't routine daily life. The Spanish virtually destroyed what remained of Totonac culture during their conquest of Mexico. Temples were dismantled, priests were killed or converted, and oral traditions were severed. By the time anyone thought to seriously document these circles, the people who built them had been gone for centuries. We're left with stones that still stand, still align with celestial events, still pose questions we're only beginning to ask properly. Climate studies of the region reveal that during the circle's construction period, the Gulf Coast experienced significant environmental changes. Rainfall patterns shifted, the coastline moved. What we see today isn't what the builders saw. That complicates interpretation even further. Some researchers propose that Chempoala was part of a larger network of similar sites stretching along the coast, most now lost to erosion, agriculture, and urban development. If that's true, we're looking at fragments of something much bigger, a systematic attempt to mark the land in ways that transcended individual settlements. The few Totonac descendants who still live in the region speak of these circles with a reverence that goes beyond tourism. They'll tell you stories passed down about the old ones, who could read the sky like we read books, who knew when rains would come, when to plant, when danger approached. The circles, they say, were tools for that reading. Modern astronomers confirm the circles tracked not only the sun, but specific pre-Columbian star patterns altered by Earth's axial precession. Chempoala remains silent, but it still asks what our ancestors knew and what we've forgotten. Deep in the Peruvian Andes, where the air thins and modern roads give way to footpaths, lies a place the Inca considered sacred long before they built their empire. Vilcabamba isn't Machu Picchu. It doesn't draw crowds or appear on travel agency brochures. The stone complex here sits at roughly 9,000 feet elevation, tucked into a valley that seems designed to keep secrets. Spanish conquistadors searched for this region obsessively in the 1500s, convinced it held the last refuge of Inca gold. They found ruins, just not the kind they were hoping for. The stones at Vilcabamba don't fit the architectural style we associate with the Inca. They're older, rougher in some ways, yet more ambitious in others. Massive blocks, some weighing upward of 70 tons, fitted together without mortar, in patterns that have survived earthquakes that leveled everything built afterward. Walk through the complex on a clear morning, and you'll notice something immediately. The stones aren't randomly placed. They form distinct clusters, each oriented toward different points on the horizon. One group faces the rising sun during June solstice. Another aligns perfectly with the Southern Cross constellation, as it appeared roughly 2,000 years ago. That dating creates problems for conventional timelines. The Inca Empire, as we know it, flourished between 1400 and 1533 AD. But radiocarbon dating of organic material found between the stone joints at Vilcabamba suggests construction phases reaching back to at least 800 AD. Some samples have tested even older, though those results remain controversial. Either the Inca inherited these structures from a predecessor culture, or our understanding of when advanced stonework began in the Andes needs serious revision. The Conquistador chronicles mention Vilcabamba repeatedly, but always in frustrating fragments. Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, writing in 1572, described it as a place of the old ones before the Inca held power. Another Spanish account calls it a fortress not made by men of this age. Dramatic language, certainly, but based on what they were seeing. Engineering that didn't match anything in their European experience. The stone complex follows the natural contours of the landscape in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if the builders were working with the mountain rather than imposing structures upon it. Terraces step down the hillside in gradual increments, each level containing stone platforms that serve no obvious agricultural purpose. Too small for significant farming, too exposed for comfortable habitation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2019 revealed something unexpected beneath the visible structures. A network of chambers and passages extending into the mountainside itself. Some appear natural, enlarged and modified by human hands. Others seem entirely excavated from solid rock. What's down there remains largely unexplored. The Peruvian government has restricted access pending proper archaeological protocols. Local Quechua communities who live in the valley below maintain traditions about Vilcabamba that don't appear in any Spanish records. They speak of it as a listening place, where ancestors came to hear messages from the earth itself. One elder interviewed during a 2015 documentary expedition described rituals where community leaders would spend nights alone among the stones, waiting for guidance on important decisions. That might sound like folklore, but acoustic studies of the site have discovered something peculiar. The stone arrangements create unusual sound properties. Certain frequencies, particularly low-range tones around 30 to 40 Hz, resonate and amplify within the complex in ways that don't occur naturally. Whether this was intentional or accidental, we can't say for certain. But it wasn't random. The engineering challenges alone should give us pause. Moving 70-ton blocks up a mountain, at elevation, without wheels or draft animals. The Inca didn't have horses until the Spanish arrived, requires knowledge of leverage, friction, and materials that we're only now beginning to appreciate. Some archaeologists propose elaborate ramp systems. Others suggest the blocks were quarried closer than we think, though geological surveys haven't confirmed nearby sources. Then there's the matter of the cuts themselves. Several stones at Vilcabamba show evidence of precise shaping, using techniques that leave marks inconsistent with bronze or stone tools, which is what the culture supposedly had access to. The cuts are too clean, the angles too exact. Some researchers have proposed harder tool materials we haven't found yet. Others suggest methods involving heat or chemical weathering to soften stone before carving. Neither explanation fully satisfies the evidence. The Spanish abandoned their search, and the Inca knowledge keepers were gone, lost to disease and conquest. On the Isle of Lewis, off the northwestern coast of Scotland, a stone tower rises from landscape that hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Dun Carlaway isn't graceful. It's not meant to be. The Broch, that's what these structures are called, stands roughly 30 feet tall now, though it once reached higher. Double-walled, hollow in the center, built from stones that fit together with a tightness that still baffles engineers who study it. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, holding fast against North Atlantic storms that have eroded coastlines and toppled everything else built in the same era. The Picts constructed Dun Carlaway sometime between 200 BC and 200 AD. At least, that's the time frame archaeologists generally agree on. But the Picts left no written records, so we're estimating based on artifacts found inside and comparisons with similar structures scattered across Scotland's northern reaches. More than 500 brochs dot the Scottish landscape. Dun Carlaway is simply one of the best preserved. Stand outside it on a winter afternoon when the light comes in low across the moorland, and you'll understand why someone chose this spot. Visibility extends for miles in every direction. The Atlantic stretches to the west. Hills roll eastward toward the interior. Anyone approaching would be seen long before they arrived. That's led to the most common explanation. These were defensive structures, fortifications built during unstable times when raids from sea or land were constant threats. The design supports this interpretation to a degree. The walls are 12 feet thick at the base. The single entrance is narrow, easily defended. Internal galleries wind upward in a spiral, creating multiple levels where defenders could position themselves. But here's what doesn't fit the fortress theory. No evidence of violence. No scorch marks from fires set during sieges. No arrowheads, No weapon caches, no skeletal remains showing trauma. Excavations inside Dun Carloway have uncovered pottery, tools, remnants of daily life. Just not the signs of conflict you'd expect from a structure supposedly built for war. The architecture itself poses questions that defensive purposes don't adequately answer. The interior space is relatively small, maybe 30 feet in diameter. You could house a family, perhaps two, but not a garrison. The galleries that wind through the walls are ingeniously constructed, true, but they're also acoustic chambers. Sound carries through them in peculiar ways. Speak at ground level in a normal voice, and someone 3 levels up hears you clearly, as if you were standing beside them. Was that intentional, or just a happy accident of double-wall construction? Archaeological evidence suggests people lived in Dun Carloway for centuries, possibly as late as the 1600s. Layers of occupation debris tell a story of continuous habitation, abandonment, reoccupation. The structure adapted to different needs across different eras, but its original purpose, what the Pictish builders had in mind, remains frustratingly unclear. Local tradition offers another perspective, though one that's harder to quantify. Older residents of Lewis, particularly those who speak Gaelic and maintain connections to pre-Christian island customs, describe brochs as threshold places, not quite of the world, not quite separate from it, places where the boundary between earthly and spiritual grew thin. That sounds mystical until you consider the alignments. Dun Carloway's entrance faces almost exactly southeast. During the winter solstice, sunrise light penetrates directly into the interior, illuminating the back wall for approximately 15 minutes before the angle shifts. The same thing happens, reversed, during summer solstice at sunset through a gap in the upper gallery. Coincidence? Perhaps. But too many brochs share similar orientations for it to be entirely accidental. The stones themselves came from nearby outcrops, which makes sense given their weight and the difficulty of transport across rough terrain. But the selection wasn't random. Geological analysis shows the builders chose specific types of rock: harder stones for corners and stress points, slightly softer material for fill. They understood load distribution, compression, how weight travels through stacked stone. Modern attempts to replicate broch construction using period-appropriate tools have largely failed. The tolerances are too tight, the engineering too sophisticated. It's possible to stack stones into tower-like shapes, certainly, but not with the stability and longevity these structures demonstrate. Climate records show colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and scarce resources during the broch era. Yet communities invested years of labor to build hundreds of these towers across islands and coasts. Why? What threat or need justified that expense? In the humid lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, a city rises from the jungle that shouldn't exist according to what we thought we knew about pre-Columbian architecture. El Tajín covers roughly a square mile of cleared forest, though ground-penetrating surveys suggest the ancient city extends far beyond what's been excavated. At its center stands the Pyramid of the Niches, a structure so geometrically precise, so mathematically deliberate, that it challenges assumptions about what cultures without written mathematical systems could achieve. The pyramid isn't massive by Mesoamerican standards. It rises only about 60 feet high. But count the niches, the square recesses built into each of its 6 levels, and you get exactly 365, one for each day of the solar year. That's not approximate, that's exact. The Totonac people, likely the same culture responsible for the Chempoala circles we discussed earlier, built El Tajín between 600 and 900 AD. At least, those are the dates that current excavations support. The city thrived during a period when the classic Maya civilization was collapsing to the south. While other Mesoamerican centers were being abandoned, El Tajin was expanding. What makes this site particularly significant isn't just one pyramid. It's the entire complex. 17 ball courts have been identified so far, more than any other Mesoamerican city. These weren't recreational facilities. The Mesoamerican ball game held profound ritual significance. Life and death stakes, quite literally, based on carved panels showing players being sacrificed after matches. But here's where El Tajin diverges from other sites: the architectural integration of seemingly incompatible elements. Pyramids aligned to solar events, ball courts oriented to stellar risings, buildings positioned to create sightlines that connect astronomical phenomena with earthly ceremonies. The whole city functions as a kind of three-dimensional calendar, marking time through stone and shadow. The niches on the pyramid create another effect that wasn't understood until recently. As the sun moves across the sky, shadows fill and empty from the recesses in a wave pattern that moves around the structure. Stand at the right position during equinox, and you can watch the shadow wave complete a full circuit in hours, giving ancient observers a visual representation of solar movement they could track and predict. Excavations beneath the visible structures have revealed earlier construction phases, some showing significantly different architectural styles. Foundation layers contain pottery and tools that predate the Totonac period, suggesting El Tajin was built atop something older, perhaps incorporating knowledge from predecessor cultures we know even less about. The ball courts themselves present engineering challenges that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The playing surfaces are sloped at precise angles, not level as you might expect. The acoustics within the courts are remarkable. Clap your hands at one end, and someone at the opposite end, roughly 150 feet away, hears a clear echo that sounds like a bird's chirp. Natural phenomenon? Or deliberate acoustic engineering built into the court's dimensions and materials? Spanish conquistadors never saw El Tajin in its glory. By the time Europeans arrived in the region, the city had been abandoned for centuries. The jungle had reclaimed it. Local indigenous people knew it was there, certainly, but they didn't speak of it much to outsiders. When archaeologists finally began serious excavations in the early 1900s, they found a city largely intact beneath the vegetation, unusual for sites that typically get scavenged for building materials over centuries. Recent LiDAR surveys, remote sensing technology that can map ground features through dense jungle canopy, have revealed that El Tajin was part of a much larger network of settlements connected by raised stone causeways. These roads, some stretching over 20 miles, linked El Tajin to other ceremonial centers in a pattern that suggests coordinated activity across the entire region. The question that bothers researchers is this: how did a culture without draft animals, without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools beyond basic copper implements, create such architectural sophistication? The standard answer involves large labor forces and long construction periods. That explains the muscle, but not the knowledge. The mathematical precision alone indicates advanced understanding. The 365 niches aren't just decorative, they're a statement. We understand the solar year. We can count it. We can build it into permanent stone. That requires observation over generations, record-keeping systems we haven't found evidence for, and transmission of knowledge across time in ways that survived despite the absence of written texts. In northern Sudan, where the Nile bends through desert that has known human settlement longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, mud brick structures rise from sand that predates the Egyptian pyramids. Kerma doesn't get the attention that Egypt commands. It sits upstream, south of the traditional pharaonic heartland, in territory that ancient Egyptians referred to as Kush. The Defufa, that's what the locals call the massive mud brick structures here, stand as monuments to a civilization that thrived when Egypt was still finding its footing. The western Defufa, the larger of the two main structures, measures roughly 160 feet long and 80 feet wide at its base. It rises 50 feet into air that shimmers with heat most of the year, built entirely from mud brick. No stone, no mortar, just Nile clay mixed with straw, shaped into blocks, dried under the African sun, then stacked into a mass that has survived nearly 4,000 years. That's the part that doesn't make sense to modern engineers. Mud brick shouldn't last that long, not in this climate, with temperature swings from scorching days to cold desert nights, not with the occasional violent rainstorm that pounds the region. The Defufa should have eroded into shapeless mounds centuries ago, but it hasn't. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 1970s revealed why. The builders used graduated brick sizes throughout the structure. Larger bricks at the base, progressively smaller as the structure rises. The clay composition varies by level as well. Different ratios of sand to silt, different binding materials mixed in. The whole thing functions as an integrated system designed to handle stress, expansion, contraction. Kerma flourished between 2500 and 1500 BC. During that millennium, it served as the capital of the Kingdom of Kush, a power that traded with Egypt, fought with Egypt, and occasionally conquered parts of Egypt. The relationship between these two Nile civilizations was complex, sometimes cooperative, often hostile, always interconnected. The eastern Defufa, smaller than its western counterpart, sits about a mile away, within what was clearly a separate ceremonial precinct. This structure shows different architectural features: interior chambers, narrow passageways, what appear to be alteration phases, suggesting it was modified multiple times over centuries of use. What were these buildings for? The honest answer is we're not entirely sure. No inscriptions explain their purpose. The Kerma culture left no extensive written records that we've deciphered. We're left interpreting based on archaeological context and comparison with other ancient structures. The most accepted theory suggests they were temples, though temples to what deity or serving what specific rituals remains unclear. Burial sites surrounding both Defufas have yielded thousands of graves, some containing individuals buried with significant wealth. Gold, ivory, elaborate pottery. The positioning of these graves in relation to the structures suggests the Defufas held religious significance, at minimum. But here's what complicates that interpretation: astronomical alignments that seem too precise to ignore. The western Defufa's main axis runs almost exactly east-west. During equinoxes, sunrise and sunset align directly with the structure's longest walls. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, we can't say definitively, but the builders certainly had the sophistication to plan such alignments if they chose to. Recent excavations have uncovered something unexpected. Beneath the visible structures lie earlier construction phases. The Defufas weren't built in single campaigns. They were raised, added to, modified over centuries. Some foundation layers contain pottery styles that predate the Kingdom of Kush itself, suggesting the site held significance even before Kerma became a political capital. The scale of labor required to build these structures was enormous. Estimates suggest the Western Defy alone required several million mud bricks. Manufacturing that many bricks, transporting them, stacking them under controlled conditions to prevent collapse during construction. That's a multi-generational project, requiring organization, planning, and a stable society capable of sustaining such efforts. Climate studies show that during Kerma's peak, the Sahara was drying, but still a transitional savanna with seasonal rain and vegetation. The Nile flooded differently, creating a landscape less harsh than today. This environment supplied clay and straw, allowing a mud brick civilization to thrive using materials renewed by the river. The kingdom of Kush fell to Egyptian expansion around 1500 BC, and Kerma was abandoned. Though pharaohs claimed victory over barbarians, archaeology tells another story. This was a sophisticated culture, building mud brick monuments that outlasted stone elsewhere. In the hills of northern Morocco, about 11 miles from the coastal town of Asila, stands a stone circle that most of the world has never heard of. Mizora doesn't appear in standard archaeology textbooks. It doesn't draw tourist crowds. The 167 standing stones, arranged in an ellipse measuring roughly 180 feet across, site on private farmland, surrounded by olive groves and wheat fields that have been cultivated for generations. Local farmers work around the stones, have done so for as long as anyone can remember, treating them as permanent features of the landscape, like hills or streams. The stones themselves aren't uniform. Some reach 10 feet tall, others barely clear 5 feet. They're arranged in a pattern that's clearly deliberate, but whose purpose remains debated. At the center of the ellipse stands a single large stone, a marker of some kind, though what it marked or why has been lost to time. Dating Mizora has proved difficult. No organic material has been found in direct association with the stones that would allow radiocarbon dating. The stones themselves are local limestone, weathered by centuries of North African sun and wind. Based on weathering patterns and comparison with other megalithic sites, estimates place construction somewhere between 3000 and 1500 BC. But that's a wide window that doesn't tell us much. What we do know comes from measurements and alignments. The ellipse's major axis runs almost perfectly north-south. The entrance, if that's what it is, faces west toward the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 15 miles distant. During spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun sets directly in line with this western opening, framing the setting sun between two larger stones that flank the entrance. That alignment alone wouldn't prove intentionality, but there's more. The ellipse's proportions follow a mathematical ratio that appears repeatedly in ancient structures worldwide, roughly 3:2, the same ratio found in the golden section that architects have used for millennia to create aesthetically pleasing proportions. Local Berber tradition holds that Mizora marks the burial site of Antaeus, the mythological giant from Greek legend whom Hercules defeated. That's almost certainly mythologized history rather than literal fact, but the persistence of the story suggests the site held significance long before Islam arrived in North Africa, long before the Romans controlled these coastal regions. Roman writers mentioned a massive circular monument somewhere in Mauritania, the ancient name for this region, but their descriptions are vague, geographic references unclear. Whether they were describing Mizora or some other site lost to time, we can't say with certainty. Excavations in the 1930s, limited and poorly documented by modern standards, uncovered fragments of pottery and tools within the circle that suggested human activity spanning millennia. Different cultural layers, different time periods, all using this same space for purposes we can only infer. The number of stones, 167, has generated speculation about numerological or astronomical significance. Some researchers have proposed lunar calendars. Others suggest the count relates to star positions visible in the ancient night sky. None of these theories have been proven conclusively, but the specific number seems too large to be purely symbolic and too precise to be random. What makes Mizora particularly intriguing in our larger investigation is its isolation. The nearest comparable stone circles sit across the Mediterranean in southern Spain and Portugal, or much farther east in the Middle East. This region of Morocco doesn't have a tradition of megalithic construction. Mizora stands alone, an anomaly in North African archaeology. Yet the construction techniques, stones selected for size and shape, positioned upright in holes dug into bedrock, secured with smaller stones wedged around the bases. Match methods used in European megalithic sites, built around the same period. Either these techniques developed independently in different regions, or there was contact between cultures we've assumed had no meaningful interaction. The farmland surrounding Mizora has yielded artifacts spanning Phoenician, Roman, and Islamic periods, evidence of continuous human presence in the area. But none of those cultures claimed credit for the circle. Each seemed to inherit it from whoever came before, treating it as something ancient even in their time. Preservation has been haphazard. Several stones have fallen over the centuries. A few were removed, presumably for building materials, before local authorities designated the site protected in the mid-1900s. What we see now is incomplete, a fragment of whatever Mizora originally was. The olive trees are young, the wheat is seasonal, but the stones have stood for millennia, silent witnesses to lost empires and forgotten meanings. In the desert of northern Saudi Arabia, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 stone pillars stand in formations that suggest purpose but reveal no clear meaning. Al-Rajajil, the name translates roughly to the men in Arabic, sits near the town of Sakaka in Al-Jaf province. Local Bedouin tribes have known about these stones for generations, weaving them into folklore about giants turned to stone or ancient warriors frozen in time. But serious archaeological attention didn't arrive until the 1970s, and even then, study has been sporadic at best. The pillars themselves range from 3 to 10 feet tall, carved from local sandstone into roughly cylindrical shapes. They're not natural formations. The shaping is too deliberate, the groupings too regular. They're arranged in clusters, most containing between 3 and 7 stones, positioned in patterns that might be circles, might be alignments, or might be something else entirely, depending on how you interpret the fallen stones, mixed among those still standing. Dating has placed construction somewhere between 4000 and 2500 BC, making Al-Rajajil contemporary with some of the earliest Egyptian dynasties. But this region wasn't Egypt. There were no pharaohs here, no centralized kingdoms that we know of. The people who built these stone formations were likely pastoral nomads, moving through the landscape with herds, following water and seasonal vegetation. That raises an immediate question. Why would nomadic people invest the labor required to quarry, shape, and erect permanent stone monuments? Nomads travel light by necessity. They don't typically build things meant to last millennia. Yet here, these pillars stand, defying that assumption. The stones showed tool marks consistent with pecking and grinding, techniques where harder stones are used to slowly abrade softer stone into desired shapes. It's labor-intensive work. Each pillar would have required days, possibly weeks, of focused effort. Multiply that across 50 pillars, and you're looking at a significant community investment. But for what purpose? The most common interpretation suggests astronomical markers. Several of the pillar groups align with solar and stellar events visible in the ancient sky. One cluster marks the winter solstice sunrise with reasonable precision. Another appears oriented toward the rising point of Sirius, though precession of the equinoxes has shifted star positions since then, making ancient alignments harder to confirm with absolute certainty. Some researchers have proposed the site served as a kind of territorial marker, a way for groups moving through the region to identify meeting places or boundaries. In a landscape as featureless as the northern Arabian desert, permanent stone markers would have provided navigation reference points visible from considerable distances. Others suggest religious significance, though evidence for specific rituals remains thin. No burials have been found directly associated with the pillars. No offerings, no ceremonial objects. Nothing that clearly indicates worship or religious practice. If Al-Rajajal was a temple of some kind, it was unlike temples elsewhere in the ancient world. Recent excavations around the site's periphery have uncovered fragments of pottery and stone tools that indicate human presence over millennia. Different styles, different periods, suggesting people returned to this location repeatedly across vast stretches of time. That pattern of reuse implies the site held enduring significance, even as the cultures inhabiting the region changed. Climate reconstruction for the period shows that northern Arabia wasn't quite the harsh desert it is today. Rainfall was higher. Seasonal lakes formed in low-lying areas. Vegetation supported larger animal populations, making the region more hospitable to human habitation. The people who built Al-Rajajil lived in an environment more forgiving than the one that surrounds these stones now. What's particularly striking about Al-Rajajil is its position in a larger pattern. Throughout the Arabian Peninsula, smaller groupings of standing stones have been documented. Nothing as concentrated as this site, but enough to suggest a broader tradition of stone monument construction in ancient Arabia that hasn't received the scholarly attention it deserves. The pillars themselves are deteriorating. Sandstone doesn't weather as well as harder stones like granite. Wind erosion, temperature fluctuations, and occasional flash floods, when rare rains come, have taken their toll. Some pillars show significant degradation compared to photographs taken just 50 years ago. Without intervention, Al-Rajajil may not survive another few centuries. Saudi authorities have begun efforts to protect the site, restricting vehicle access and installing monitoring equipment to track weathering rates. But preservation in this climate is challenging. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at an elevation of roughly 7,000 feet, stands a stone temple that predates the Christian kingdom of Aksum by centuries. Yeha doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell about ancient Africa. The great temple here, with its precisely fitted stone walls still standing 40 feet high in places, represents architectural sophistication that challenges assumptions about when and where advanced building techniques developed on the continent. The structure dates to approximately 700 BC, placing it firmly in the pre-Aksumite period. This was ancient South Arabian influence, reaching across the Red Sea into the Ethiopian highlands, bringing with it architectural traditions, religious practices, and stoneworking knowledge that would fundamentally shape the region's development. The temple's walls are remarkable for their construction. Large limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar in a style that echoes techniques used in Yemen across the water. But these aren't crude imitations of foreign architecture. The builders adapted those techniques to local materials and conditions, creating something that belongs specifically to this highland environment. Walk around the perimeter, and you'll notice the precision. The corners meet at exact right angles. The courses of stone remain level across spans of 30 feet or more. The blocks themselves show minimal gaps between them, tight enough that a knife blade won't fit in most joints. That level of accuracy requires sophisticated surveying tools and mathematical understanding of angles and proportions. The temple originally stood as part of a larger complex. Excavations have revealed foundation walls of surrounding structures, evidence of courtyards, what appear to be ceremonial pools or cisterns. Yeha wasn't just a temple, it was a religious center serving a wider community, drawing pilgrims or worshippers from the surrounding region. The deity worshipped here was likely Al-Maka, the moon god of the Sabaean culture centered in Yemen. Inscriptions found at the site, written in the ancient South Arabian script, reference this deity and describe offerings made by local rulers. These texts provide rare written evidence of the culture that built Yeha, though frustratingly, they tell us more about who made offerings than about the structure itself or how it was built. What puzzles archaeologists is the complete absence of construction debris around the site. When ancient peoples built large stone structures, they left behind evidence of the work: broken tools, discarded stone chips, construction ramps, quarry sites nearby. Yeha shows almost none of this. Either the site was meticulously cleaned after construction, which seems unlikely, or the building techniques employed methods that didn't generate the waste we'd expect. The stones themselves came from quarries located several miles away, according to geological analysis. Moving multi-ton blocks across that distance, then up to this elevated site, would have required organization and labor resources, indicating a stable, structured society capable of sustaining such projects over years or decades. The interior of the temple has been modified over subsequent centuries. Christian monks occupied Yeha, starting around the 6th century AD, converting the ancient temple into a church. They built walls inside the original structure, added windows, installed altars. These modifications make it difficult to determine exactly what the temple's interior configuration looked like originally. But the exterior walls remain largely as they were built 27 centuries ago. The limestone has weathered, certainly. Lichens grow in patches on the northern faces where moisture collects. But the structural integrity hasn't failed. No major collapses, no significant shifting of the massive blocks. Recent studies using ground-penetrating radar have suggested there may be chambers or passages beneath the temple that haven't been excavated. Ethiopian authorities have been cautious about invasive archaeology at Yeha, particularly given its continued use as a religious site by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The monastery built within and around the ancient temple remains active, monks still conducting services in spaces that have seen worship in various forms for nearly 3,000 years. The connection between Yeha and the later Aksumite kingdom remains a subject of scholarly debate. Aksum, which rose to prominence starting around the 1st century AD, built its own impressive stone architecture, including massive carved obelisks and palace complexes. Did Aksumite builders learn from Yeha, Or were both cultures drawing on the same South Arabian architectural traditions independently? What's clear is that Yehar demonstrates that advanced stone architecture in highland Ethiopia has roots reaching back far earlier than the better-known Aksumite period. Beneath the Temple of Seti, the first at Abydos in southern Egypt, lies a structure that doesn't belong to the same architectural tradition as the temple built above it. The Osirian, named for its supposed association with Osiris, god of the underworld, sits roughly 50 feet below ground level, carved from bedrock and constructed from limestone and granite blocks that dwarf anything in the temple overhead. Some of these blocks weigh upward of 100 tons. They're fitted together with a precision that's difficult to explain, using the tools and techniques we assume the ancient Egyptians possessed. The conventional timeline places the Osirian's construction during Seti I's reign, roughly 1300 BC. After all, it sits directly behind his temple. The association seems obvious, but archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. The architectural style is completely different from anything else built during the 19th dynasty. The Osirian uses massive megalithic blocks with minimal decoration. Stark, geometric, focused on weight and mass, rather than the elaborate carvings and paintings that characterize New Kingdom Egyptian architecture. It resembles nothing else from Seti's period. Instead, it looks remarkably similar to structures from the Old Kingdom, particularly the valley temples associated with the Giza pyramids, built roughly 1,000 years earlier. Same construction techniques, same use of enormous stones, same emphasis on geometric precision over decorative elements. That similarity has led some researchers to propose that the Osirian is far older than the temple above it, that Seti I's builders discovered an ancient structure already there and incorporated it into their temple complex, perhaps interpreting it as a sacred site worth preserving. The layout supports this interpretation. The Osirian consists of a central hall, surrounded by a moat-like channel, with massive pillars supporting enormous lintels overhead. The whole thing would have been covered originally, creating a dark, enclosed space with water flowing around the central platform. Water is key to understanding this structure's purpose, or at least its symbolic meaning. The ancient Egyptians associated the primordial mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation, with Osiris and resurrection. The Osirian's design, with its central island surrounded by water, clearly references that mythology. But here's where things get stranger. The water wasn't decorative. The moat channels connected to the Nile's groundwater table. When the river flooded annually, water would rise through the channels, actually flooding the structure to depths of several feet. The central platform would become an island, just as mythology described the primordial mound. That's sophisticated hydraulic engineering. The channels had to be precisely calculated to allow water in and out without eroding the structure or flooding uncontrollably. The platform height had to be exact, tall enough to remain above the water during a flooding, but not so tall that the symbolic effect was lost. Excavations in the early 1900s, when the Osirian was first properly documented, found that silt deposits inside the structure reached depths suggesting flooding continued for centuries. This wasn't a one-time effect. This was a structure designed to flood and drain repeatedly, year after year, as part of its intended function. The granite used in construction came from Aswan, roughly 200 miles south. Moving 100-ton blocks that distance, then lowering them into a pit 50 feet deep with the precision required for the tight joints we see, represents an engineering challenge that modern contractors would struggle with using current equipment. Standard explanations involve ramps, levers, and massive labor forces. Those methods can move stone, certainly, but they don't adequately explain the precision. The granite blocks in the Osirian fit together with gaps measuring fractions of an inch, across joints spanning 20 feet. That's not the result of brute force. That's careful planning and execution, requiring accurate measurement and mathematical understanding. Tool marks on the granite show evidence of methods that don't match what we know about bronze or copper tools available in ancient Egypt. Some cuts appear too clean, too straight, suggesting either harder tools we haven't found evidence for, or techniques involving abrasives and time that we haven't fully reconstructed. The ceiling blocks, enormous lintels weighing dozens of tons each, pose their own questions. How do you position those precisely atop pillars while working 50 feet below ground level in a confined space? The logistics alone seem nearly impossible. Yet there they sit, still bearing their tremendous weight after 3,000 years minimum. The Osirian hides its secrets in plain sight, beneath a familiar temple, quietly challenging accepted timelines. In the foothills of central Greece, near the city of Volos, lies evidence of Europe's earliest known organized settlement, a community that thrived when most of the continent was still inhabited by scattered hunter-gatherer groups. Sesklo dates to approximately 7,000 BC. That's 9,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, this settlement was already ancient when the first pyramids were being planned in Egypt. The people living here were farming, raising livestock, and building permanent stone structures, while much of Europe was still living in temporary shelters. The settlement covers roughly 50 acres, though the core residential area is smaller, perhaps 50 acres of concentrated building. What makes Sesklo significant isn't just its age, it's the level of organization visible in the ruins. This wasn't a random clustering of huts. The buildings follow planned layouts. Streets run in deliberate patterns. There's evidence of communal structures separate from residential spaces. The houses themselves were rectangular, built from stone foundations supporting mud brick walls. Roofs were likely thatch or wood, which haven't survived, but post holes and wall configurations suggest pitched roofs designed to shed the region's winter rains. Some structures had 2 stories, with stone staircases still visible in the archaeological record. What's remarkable is the consistency. The buildings show similar construction techniques, similar dimensions, similar layouts across the settlement. That implies shared knowledge, shared standards, some form of community planning that went beyond individual families, building whatever suited their immediate needs. The site's centerpiece is what archaeologists call the Acropolis, a raised area with larger structures built on stone platforms. One building in particular stands out, roughly 30 feet long, divided into multiple rooms, with foundations indicating substantial walls capable of supporting significant weight. This was likely a communal building, perhaps for gatherings, storage, or religious ceremonies. Excavations have revealed sophisticated pottery throughout the settlement. Not crude vessels, but well-formed pieces with decorative patterns showing artistic sensibility and technical skill. The clay was tempered, fired at controlled temperatures in kilns that would have required knowledge of combustion and heat management. These people understood materials science in practical, applied ways. Agricultural evidence shows they were growing emmer wheat and barley, along with lentils and peas. They kept sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. This wasn't subsistence farming. The variety and quantities suggest surplus production, food security beyond immediate needs. That surplus is what allows communities to develop specialized skills, pottery, building, tool-making, because not everyone needs to spend all their time producing food. Tool assemblages from Sesklo show the transition from stone to early metallurgy. While most tools were still stone, obsidian from the island of Melos, flint from local sources, a few copper objects have been found in later layers, dating to around 5,500 BC. These early metal items weren't practical tools yet. They were ornamental, status objects, suggesting developing social hierarchies and trade networks sophisticated enough to move materials between regions. The obsidian is particularly telling. Melos sits roughly 150 miles southeast across open water. Getting obsidian from there to Sesklo required maritime trade networks, boats, navigation knowledge, established exchange relationships between distant communities. This wasn't isolated village life. These people were connected to broader regional systems. Climate studies of the period show favorable conditions for agriculture in this part of Greece. Temperatures were stable, rainfall adequate, growing seasons long enough to support the crops they were cultivating. The environment was conducive to settled life in ways that encouraged the kind of long-term investment we see in Sesklo's architecture. But here's what's puzzling. The settlement was abandoned around 5,500 BC, after flourishing for roughly 1,500 years. There's no clear evidence of destruction, no signs of warfare or catastrophic events. The people simply left. Later occupations occurred on the site, but they were different cultures with different building traditions. The original Sesklo culture disappeared. Where did they go? Did they migrate to other regions, carrying their agricultural knowledge and building techniques with them? Or did the community disperse, absorbed into other groups? The archaeological record doesn't provide clear answers. The ruins at Sesklo sit quietly, with stone foundations outlining buildings and streets visible as slight depressions. Excavation trenches cut through layers of human occupation, revealing walls, floors, and the material remains of daily life from 9 millennia ago. On a small island in the Gulf of Morbihan, off the coast of Brittany, France, sits a stone monument that represents one of the finest examples of Neolithic art in all of Europe. Gavrinis is a burial cairn, a massive mound of stone covering a passage grave, constructed around 3,500 BC. That places it in the same time frame as the early phases of Stonehenge, though the two monuments couldn't be more different in style and execution. The cairn itself rises roughly 20 feet above the island's highest point, built from an estimated 10,000 to 14,000 tons of stone. Local granite, quarried from outcrops visible on the Breton coast, transported to this island by methods we can only partially reconstruct. The exterior would have been smooth once, carefully stacked to create a dome-like profile. Erosion and stone robbing over millennia have left it rougher, but the basic form remains intact. The real significance lies inside. A passage roughly 40 feet long leads from the cairn's southern edge to a central chamber. The passage is lined with 29 stone slabs, each standing upright, each covered almost entirely with carved designs. These aren't random decorations. The carvings show deliberate patterns, spirals, concentric arcs, U-shapes, serpentine lines, axes, geometric forms that repeat with variations across multiple stones. The density of carving is extraordinary. Nearly every available surface on the passage stones bears decoration. Someone invested hundreds, possibly thousands of hours, pecking these designs into hard granite using stone tools. The central chamber, roughly 8 feet square, sits beneath a massive capstone weighing an estimated 17 tons. This single stone had to be positioned precisely atop the chamber walls, at the center of the cairn, before the entire structure was covered with thousands of tons of additional stone. The engineering required for that placement alone represents sophisticated understanding of forces, balance, and structural stability. What do the carvings mean? That's been debated since the cairn was first properly studied in the 1830s. Some patterns resemble natural forms, waves perhaps, or representations of water. The site's position on an island, surrounded by tidal waters that change dramatically twice daily, lends support to water-related interpretations. Other designs suggest astronomical significance. Certain arc patterns, when measured carefully, correspond to lunar cycles visible in the Neolithic sky. The spirals might represent solar movement, the turning of seasons, or cosmological concepts about birth, death, and renewal that burial monuments naturally evoke. But here's what complicates simple interpretations. Several of the stones in Gavrinis were reused from earlier structures. They were already carved when they were incorporated into this cairn. That means some of the designs we see weren't created for this specific monument. They belonged to something else first, something older, something that was dismantled to build what we see now. One stone in particular, stone C7 in archaeological notation, shows a pattern that matches almost exactly with designs on standing stones at other Breton sites, some located miles away. Either the same carvers worked across multiple sites, or there was a shared symbolic language being expressed in stone across the region. Excavations inside the chamber found evidence of cremated human remains, though not many. This massive structure, requiring enormous communal effort to construct, apparently served as a tomb for only a select few individuals. That suggests social stratification. Chiefs, priests, individuals of high status receiving burial rites unavailable to common people. The passage alignment is significant. It opens to the southeast, positioned so that during winter solstice, the rising sun's light penetrates deep into the passage, illuminating the chamber briefly. That solar connection appears intentional, linking death, burial, and the seasonal renewal promised by the sun's return from its southernmost point. Recent analysis using photogrammetry, detailed three-dimensional mapping of the carvings, has revealed that some designs were carved in multiple phases. Earlier, shallower carvings were later enhanced or modified with deeper pecking. The monument wasn't decorated all at once. It was worked over time, perhaps across generations, with each phase adding or altering what came before. The tiny island of Gavrinis, barely 10 acres, would have been dominated by its massive cairn, visible to anyone approaching by boat. The Gulf of Morbihan holds hundreds of megalithic monuments from a 1,000-year Neolithic period, where communities express themselves through stone. Gavrinis stands out, not largest or oldest, but the most artistically sophisticated, with carvings spiraling across passage stones, still posing questions about their meaning after 5,000 years. From the Gulf Coast of Mexico to the highlands of Georgia, from Scottish islands to Arabian deserts, we've traced a pattern that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods, yet the same techniques appear repeatedly. Astronomical alignments that track celestial events with precision, massive stones fitted without mortar, acoustic properties that seem too deliberate to be accidental, geometric proportions that mirror mathematical constants. Were these parallel developments, human minds, independently reaching similar solutions to universal questions? Or was there contact, knowledge exchange across distances we've assumed were unbridgeable? The stones can't tell us. They can only stand as they have for millennia, marking knowledge that survived in architecture long after the builders themselves were forgotten. What connected these ancient engineers remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. And perhaps that's exactly what they intended. Questions carved in stone, waiting for us to finally ask the right ones. If this exploration into our forgotten past intrigued you, subscribe to support more investigations into the mysteries our ancestors left behind. There are more stories waiting in stone. In the desert west of Cairo, about 20 miles south of the Giza Plateau, there's a site called Saqqara. Most people know it for the Step Pyramid, the oldest major stone structure in Egypt. But walk a little farther into the sand, past the tourist paths, and you'll find something that doesn't belong in any textbook. A staircase leading underground, narrow tunnels, and at the end of those tunnels, 24 granite boxes that weigh as much as a loaded freight train. They call it the Serapeum, and nobody can explain it. The man who rediscovered these tunnels was a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette. It was 1850. He'd been sent to Egypt to acquire Coptic manuscripts, but he got distracted. He noticed sphinx heads poking out of the sand and decided to dig. What he found beneath the surface was a labyrinth, long corridors carved directly into the limestone bedrock, stretching for hundreds of feet. And inside those corridors, arranged in side chambers, were these enormous stone boxes. Sarcophagi, technically, but not like any sarcophagi you've seen before. Each one was carved from a single block of granite, not assembled, not pieced together. One solid block, hollowed out, with a matching lid that weighed another 20 tons. The corners are sharp. The surfaces are smooth. Some are polished to a near mirror finish. When you run your hand along the inside, you can barely feel a seam. And here's the thing. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth. To shape it like this, with the tools we believe the ancient Egyptians had, should have taken years per box, maybe decades. Mariette assumed they were meant for bulls, sacred Apis bulls to be specific. There's a tradition in Egypt of mummifying these animals and honoring them as incarnations of the god Ptah. Some of the boxes do contain the remains of bulls, but not all of them. In fact, most were empty when Mariette opened them, and the few that did contain remains, well, the bones didn't quite fit. They were loose, disorganized, like someone had placed them there as an afterthought. So why build something this massive for a bull? Why use granite instead of limestone, which would have been far easier to work with? Why polish the inside to a degree of precision that wouldn't matter if you're just storing remains? The effort involved seems completely out of proportion to the purpose. There's another problem. The tunnels themselves are barely wide enough to walk through in some places. Moving a 70-ton box down these corridors, around corners, and into position would have required engineering we're still not sure the Egyptians possessed at that time. No ramps, no tool marks on the walls to suggest how they dragged them in. Just the boxes, sitting there in the dark, impossibly heavy and impossibly precise. Some researchers have measured the tolerances on these boxes with modern instruments. The flatness of the surfaces, the squareness of the corners. They're accurate to within a few thousandths of an inch. That's the kind of precision you'd expect from a machinist, not a stoneworker with a copper chisel and a wooden mallet. And yet, according to the conventional timeline, these boxes were carved sometime during the New Kingdom, around 3,000 years ago, maybe earlier. The orthodox explanation is that they were created for the Apis bull cult, and that the Egyptians simply had techniques we've lost or underestimated. That's possible. History is full of forgotten methods, but it doesn't explain why some boxes show signs of being unfinished, abandoned mid-polish, as if whoever was making them stopped suddenly and never came back. It doesn't explain why there are no inscriptions, no cartouches, no dedications. Egyptian tombs are usually covered in text. These boxes are silent. There are other theories, of course. Some say the Serapeum predates the dynastic Egyptians entirely, that it was built by an earlier civilization with different technology, different priorities. Others suggest the boxes weren't meant for storage at all, that they served some other function we haven't considered. Acoustic chambers, resonance devices, symbolic objects representing something we've lost the context to understand. But here's what we know for certain. 24 granite boxes, weighing a combined total of nearly 2,000 tons, were carved, moved, and placed underground at Saqqara. The people who did it left almost no record of why, and despite more than a century of study, we still can't replicate what they did with the tools they supposedly had. The Serapeum doesn't scream for attention. It just sits there, beneath the sand, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. It's where writing began, where cities first rose from the mud, where humans figured out how to organize themselves into something resembling civilization. And right there, at the very beginning, the Sumerians built something peculiar. Mountains that weren't mountains, massive stepped platforms rising out of the flat plains, made entirely by human hands. They called them ziggurats. The word itself comes from the Akkadian language. It means to build on a raised area. But that description doesn't quite capture what you're looking at when you see one. These weren't just buildings, they were statements. The great ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved examples, had a base that covered roughly the same area as a city block. 3 terraces stacked on top of each other, connected by staircases that climbed straight up the face. At the top, a temple, and at the very center of that temple, a room where supposedly no one went except the priests, and on occasion, the god himself. That's what the Sumerians believed. Each ziggurat was a home for a specific deity. The god would descend from the heavens, land on the platform, and conduct business with the city through the priesthood. It was a meeting place between earth and sky, a bridge. But here's where it gets interesting. We don't actually know how they built them. The ziggurats were made from millions of mud bricks, literally millions. Each brick had to be molded, dried in the sun, and then stacked with mortar made from bitumen, natural asphalt that seeps out of the ground in that region. It's durable stuff. Some of these structures have been standing for over 4,000 years. But the engineering required to make a mud brick building, that tall, that stable, without it collapsing under its own weight, that takes knowledge, mathematics, an understanding of load distribution, drainage, foundation settling. The Sumerians didn't leave blueprints. They left cuneiform tablets with records of grain stores, legal disputes, and religious hymns, but almost nothing about construction. We have to reverse engineer their methods by looking at what's still standing. And what's still standing shouldn't work as well as it does. Take the drainage system. Mesopotamia floods. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers don't stay in their banks. Rain comes hard and fast when it comes at all. If you build a massive mud brick structure without accounting for water, it's going to dissolve. The Sumerians knew this, so they designed weep holes, small channels running through the core of the ziggurat that allowed water to escape without eroding the structure. They also fired some of the bricks on the outer layers to make them waterproof. But the interior bricks, still just sun-dried mud. And yet they hold. Then there's the geometry. Ziggurats aren't perfectly symmetrical. If you measure them carefully, you'll notice slight curves, deliberate irregularities. Some researchers think this was intentional, a way to account for the visual distortion that happens when you look up at something that tall. The same principle the Greeks would later use on the Parthenon. But the Sumerians were doing it 1,000 years earlier. Now, the part that keeps people up at night, we're not entirely sure what happened inside these temples. The common explanation is that they were used for rituals, offerings, prayers. The king would climb the stairs, meet with the high priest, and conduct whatever ceremony was needed to keep the gods happy and the crops growing. That makes sense, but there are odd details in the records. References to sacred marriages performed at the top of the ziggurat between the king and a priestess representing the goddess Inanna. Not symbolic. Actual, ritualized unions meant to ensure fertility for the land. And then there are the sleeping chambers. Some ziggurats had rooms at the top where, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, a woman would spend the night alone, waiting for the god to arrive. Herodotus wasn't always reliable. He wrote his accounts centuries after the ziggurats were built, based on second-hand stories, but the details stuck. Why would a culture as pragmatic as the Sumerians dedicate that much labor, that many resources, to a bedroom for a god who may or may not show up? There's another layer to this. The Sumerians didn't see their gods the way we think of gods today. They weren't abstract. They weren't metaphors. They were real physical beings who walked among people, made demands, got angry, played favorites. The ziggurats were built with that understanding. So when the texts say, the gods descended to the temple at the top, the Sumerians meant it literally. We can measure the ziggurat. We can analyze the bricks. We can trace the trade routes that brought the bitumen from hundreds of miles away. But we can't quite explain why they felt the need to build a staircase to heaven. Japan, 5th century. Across the islands, something strange is happening. People are dying, as people do, and they're being buried in massive earthen mounds. Kofun, they're called. Some of these tombs stretch longer than 3 football fields. They're shaped like keyholes when seen from above, a round section attached to a triangular section, and they're surrounded by moats. Inside, the bodies of kings, warriors, leaders, but outside, arranged in careful rows along the slopes and edges of these mounds, are figures, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. They're made of clay, hollow, baked hard, and they're staring at you. The Japanese call them haniwa. It means circle of clay, but that name doesn't capture what they really are. These aren't just pottery. They're people, animals, houses, boats, shields, quivers full of arrows, an entire world, frozen in terracotta, built to surround the dead. Some of them are simple, cylinders with faces. Others are detailed, warriors in full armor, their hands gripping swords that have long since rotted away. Women with elaborate hairstyles, their expressions calm, patient. Horses with saddles, chickens, dogs, even musicians, caught mid-performance, holding instruments we can still recognize. They were placed in a specific arrangement, like an audience, all facing outward from the tomb, watching, guarding, waiting. But here's the question. No one's been able to answer definitively, what were they for? The easy answer is ritual, protection. The Haniwa were meant to stand watch over the dead, to keep evil spirits away, to serve the deceased in the afterlife. That's what most textbooks will tell you, and there's evidence to support it. Similar traditions exist all over the world. Terracotta armies in China, Ushabti figures in Egypt. The idea of equipping the dead for the next life is practically universal. But the Haniwa are different in one key way. They weren't buried with the dead. They were placed on top of the tombs, exposed to the elements, visible to anyone passing by. That's not how you treat something sacred. That's how you display something. A message, a statement. The Kofun period, when these tombs were built, was a time of consolidation in Japan. Clans were competing for power. Alliances were fragile. A leader's death was a vulnerable moment, and the size of the tomb you built for them communicated how much influence your family still had. The bigger the tomb, the more Haniwa you could afford to commission, the clearer the signal. We're still here, and we're not going anywhere. So maybe the Haniwa weren't just for the dead. Maybe they were for the living, a way to project strength, to remind neighboring clans that this family had resources, artisans, laborers, that they could mobilize thousands of people to shape clay, fire kilns, and arrange an army of figures on a hillside just to honor one person. But that still doesn't explain the details. Why are some of the Haniwa smiling? Not all of them. Most have neutral expressions, but a few, scattered among the rows, have these subtle, almost playful grins. Why would a funerary object look happy? Why give a guardian figure a sense of humor? And why are there so many different types? You'd expect soldiers maybe, attendants, but chickens, farmers, musicians. One tomb had a Haniwa shaped like a house, complete with a thatched roof and a doorway. Another had a boat. These aren't just symbolic protectors. They're a snapshot of daily life, a catalogue of everything the deceased might need, or everything they left behind. There's a theory that the Haniwa tradition started as a substitute for human sacrifice. Before the Kofun period, there are accounts, hazy, possibly exaggerated, of retainers being buried alive with their lords. The logic was simple. If you served someone in life, you'd continue serving them in death. But at some point, someone decided that was wasteful. So they started making clay replicas instead. The Haniwa became stand-ins, proxies for the people who would have died. If that's true, it raises another question. Did the people who made these figures see them as alive in some way? Did they believe the clay could hold a spirit, a presence? Because when you look at them up close, there's something unsettling about the way they're posed. They're not stiff. They're not lifeless. They have weight, personality. You get the sense that if you turned your back, they might shift just slightly. The Kofun period ended around the 7th century. Buddhism spread across Japan, and burial practices changed. The great tombs stopped being built. The Haniwa tradition faded. Most of the figures weathered away, dissolved by rain and wind. The ones that survived were buried under soil, forgotten for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists started uncovering them in the late 19th century, they didn't know what to make of them. In some ways, we still don't. Back to Egypt, back to Saqqara. But this time, we're not talking about giant boxes. We're talking about a man named Meroruka. He lived during the 6th dynasty, around 2300 BC. He was a vizier, basically the second most powerful person in Egypt after the pharaoh. He served under King Teti, and at some point, he married Teti's daughter. That made him family. That gave him privilege. And when he died, he got a tomb that reflected just how important he'd been. 32 rooms. That's how big his tomb is. 32 separate chambers, all carved into the limestone bedrock, all connected by corridors and doorways. The walls are covered floor to ceiling with reliefs, scenes from his life, his accomplishments, his journey into the afterlife. It's one of the largest and most elaborate private tombs ever found in Egypt. And inside, there's something that doesn't quite fit. Room 6. That's where it is. You walk through the entrance, past the offering hall, past the depictions of Meroruka hunting and fishing and overseeing workers. You move deeper into the tomb, and the reliefs start to change. They get more detailed, more specific, and then you reach this particular chamber, and on the wall, among all the standard Egyptian iconography, there's a panel that shows something unusual. A surgical procedure. Not a ritual, not symbolic. An actual medical operation, depicted with the kind of precision you'd expect from an instructional diagram. There's a patient lying down. There are attendants holding the patient steady. And there's a figure, presumably a physician, performing what looks like a circumcision. The tools are shown. The hand positions are shown. The angle of the incision is shown. It's clinical. Egypt had doctors. We know that. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, shows that the Egyptians understood anatomy, fractures, wound treatment, even basic surgical techniques. But those texts were written for physicians. They were practical, educational. This relief in Meroruka's tomb isn't a textbook, it's a tomb decoration. So why is it there? One possibility is that Meroruka himself was a physician, or maybe he oversaw medical practitioners as part of his duties as vizier. The titles inscribed in his tomb list him as chief of the great house and inspector of the priests, but there's no explicit mention of medicine. Still, it's possible. The Egyptians didn't always separate roles the way we do. A priest could be a doctor. A scribe could be an architect. Meroruka could have been many things. But here's the part that makes people pause. The level of detail in that surgical scene suggests familiarity. Whoever carved that relief knew what they were depicting. They understood the procedure well enough to show it accurately. And that raises questions about how advanced Egyptian medicine really was. There are other scenes in the tomb that hint at the same thing. In one chamber, there's a depiction of what appears to be a dental procedure. A figure is seated, mouth open, while another figure works inside with a small tool. In another room, there's a scene showing what might be the setting of a broken bone, an attendant holding a limb while another wraps it. These aren't common images in Egyptian tombs. Most tombs show farming, hunting, banquets, religious rituals. Meroruka's tomb shows medicine. And then there's the statue. In the main burial chamber, carved directly out of the bedrock, there's a life-size statue of Meroruka himself. He's standing, 1 foot forward, arms at his sides. It's a standard Egyptian pose, but the execution is anything but standard. The proportions are exact. The muscle definition is subtle but present. The face has individuality. This isn't a generic representation of a nobleman. This is a portrait. Whoever carved it spent time studying Mereruka, understanding his build, his features, his presence. The Egyptians believed that a statue could serve as a vessel for the ka, the life force of the deceased. If the body was destroyed, the ka could inhabit the statue instead. That's why so many tombs have statues, but most of them are stylized, idealized. Mereruka's statue looks real, like he might blink. There's an air vent in the tomb, a narrow shaft that runs from the burial chamber to the surface. Officially, it's there to allow the ka to move freely between the tomb and the outside world. But it also does something else. It circulates air. It keeps the interior dry. It prevents the kind of moisture buildup that would damage the reliefs. Whether that was intentional or just a fortunate side effect, we don't know. What we do know is this: Mereruka's tomb is a time capsule, a detailed record of one man's life, his work, his world. And buried in those details are glimpses of knowledge we didn't think the Egyptians had. Or maybe they did, and we just haven't been paying close enough attention. 1947. A Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Eddeeb is looking for a lost goat near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. It's rocky terrain, full of caves carved into the limestone cliffs by wind and water. He tosses a stone into one of the openings, hoping to scare the goat out. Instead, he hears something break: clay, pottery. He climbs inside and finds jars. Tall, cylindrical jars sealed with lids, and inside those jars, wrapped in linen, are scrolls, ancient scrolls, leather and papyrus covered in Hebrew text. He had no idea what he'd just found. None of us did. Not at first. Over the next decade, more caves were discovered. 11 in total, all within a few miles of that first site near Qumran. Inside those caves, archaeologists and Bedouins pulled out roughly 900 documents. Some were complete scrolls. Most were fragments, thousands of pieces, some no bigger than a postage stamp. Together, they represented the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible by 1,000 years. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest complete Hebrew Bible we had dated to around 1000 AD. The scrolls pushed that back to 200 BC, maybe earlier. That's a staggering jump. And when scholars started comparing the texts, they found something remarkable. The words hadn't changed, not significantly. 1,000 years of copying, and the scribes had kept the text almost identical. That kind of accuracy, maintained across centuries, speaks to a level of care we rarely see. But the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just copies of the Bible. That's the part most people miss. Only about 200 of the scrolls are biblical texts. The rest are something else: commentaries, prayers, community rules, apocalyptic visions, instructions for daily life, for ritual purity, for war. These weren't synagogue documents. They were library scrolls, someone's personal or communal collection. The question is, whose? The prevailing theory is that the scrolls belonged to a Jewish sect called the Essenes. They were separatists, ascetics, people who believed the religious establishment in Jerusalem had become corrupt. So they left. They went into the desert near Qumran and built a community, a place where they could live according to their interpretation of the law, away from the influence of the priests and the Romans. The scrolls according to this theory, were their texts. When the Roman army marched toward Qumran during the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the Essenes hid the scrolls in caves, hoping to retrieve them later. They never did. It's a tidy explanation, and there's evidence for it. The ruins at Qumran show signs of communal living, ritual baths, a dining hall, a scriptorium where scribes might have worked. Inkwells were found, pottery that matches the jars in the caves. The timeline fits, but not everyone agrees. Some scholars point out that the scrolls show diversity, different handwriting, different theological perspectives. Some texts are strictly legalistic, others are mystical, almost poetic. If these were all written by one sect, why the variation? Why would a group that valued purity and uniformity preserve documents that contradicted each other? There's another problem. The caves are spread out. Some are close to Qumran, others are miles away. If the Essenes were hiding their library in a hurry, why scatter it? Why not put everything in one secure location? An alternative theory suggests the scrolls didn't come from Qumran at all. They came from Jerusalem. When the Romans laid siege to the city, people fled with whatever they could carry. Priests, scholars, families, they grabbed their most valuable possessions and ran. For many that meant scrolls, sacred texts, legal documents. They hid them in the desert caves, intending to come back. The war ended. The city fell. Most of them never returned. If that's true, then the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the library of one community. They're fragments from many. A snapshot of Jewish thought and practice in the final days before the temple was destroyed. That would explain the diversity, the contradictions, the sheer range of material. But it also raises another question. If these scrolls were so important enough to risk carrying them through a war zone, why were they never recovered? Did the people who hid them die? Were they killed, captured, scattered? Or did they simply forget where they'd hidden them? There's one scroll in particular that still haunts researchers, the Copper Scroll. Unlike the others, it's not written on leather or papyrus. It's engraved on copper sheets, rolled up and hidden in Cave 3. And it's not a religious text. It's a list, a treasure map. It describes 64 locations around Jerusalem and the surrounding area where gold, silver, and sacred objects were supposedly buried. Tons of it. No one's ever found the treasure, and no one's entirely sure it exists, but someone thought it was worth writing down. Peru, a small town called Ica, tucked into the coastal deserts south of Lima. In the 1960s, a local doctor named Javier Cabrera started collecting stones. Not just any stones, river rocks, andesite mostly, ranging from the size of your fist to the size of a beach ball. And carved into these stones were images, thousands of images, dinosaurs walking alongside humans, ancient surgeries, heart transplants, brain operations, star maps, flying machines, scenes that shouldn't exist. Cabrera claimed he'd been given the first stone as a paperweight, a gift from a farmer. Intrigued, he started asking around, and more stones appeared. Lots of them. By the time he died in 2001, he'd amassed a collection of over 15,000 pieces, all decorated with engravings that seemed to depict an impossible history. He opened a museum. He wrote books. He believed these stones were evidence of an advanced pre-Columbian civilization, maybe older, that possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to rediscover. The problem is, nobody knows where the stones actually came from. The farmers who sold them to Cabrera gave vague answers. They said they found them in caves, in riverbeds, buried in the desert. But when pressed for specifics, the stories changed. Locations shifted. Details got fuzzy. And when the Peruvian government started investigating, because selling archaeological artifacts is illegal in Peru, the farmers admitted they'd made the whole thing up. They said they carved the stones themselves, sold them to tourists, and Cabrera had simply been a good customer. Case closed, right? Hoax. Move on. Except it's not that simple. Some of the stones show a patina, a surface coating that forms over centuries of exposure to the elements. That takes time. You can fake a lot of things, but faking patina convincingly is difficult. There are also stones in museum collections that were documented decades before Cabrera started collecting. Stones with similar engravings, acquired from the Ica region in the early 1900s. So either this hoax has been running for over a century, or something else is going on. The engravings themselves are unusual. They're incised, not carved, in relief. Someone used a pointed tool to scratch lines into the rock, creating images through repeated scoring. It's labor-intensive. Each stone would have taken hours, maybe days, depending on the complexity. And the images aren't random. There are recurring themes. Animals, some recognizable, others not. Human figures performing tasks. Geometric patterns. On some stones, there are what appear to be maps, continents with coastlines that don't match modern geography. And then there are the dinosaurs. That's the part that gets attention. Multiple stones show what look like sauropods, long-necked creatures with thick tails, standing next to humans. In some images, the humans are riding them. In others, they're hunting them. The proportions are off, and the anatomy isn't quite right, but the general shape is there. Critics point out that the concept of dinosaurs didn't exist until the 19th century, so any depiction of them on ancient stones has to be modern. There's no other explanation, unless whoever carved them was working from something they'd actually seen. Not living dinosaurs, nothing that dramatic, but fossils. The Ica region is rich in prehistoric remains, marine fossils mostly, from when the area was underwater millions of years ago. But there are also land fossils, large bones, skulls, fragments of creatures that haven't walked the earth in a very long time. Could someone have found those remains, tried to reconstruct what the animal looked like, and carved an image based on their interpretation? It's not impossible. Indigenous cultures all over the world have origin stories involving giant bones and strange creatures. They didn't call them dinosaurs, but they noticed them. Still, that doesn't explain the surgeries. Several stones show detailed medical procedures, a figure lying on a table, another figure standing over them, hands inside the chest cavity, apparently performing an operation. There are depictions of what looks like blood transfusions, tubes connecting one person to another, caesarean sections, organ transplants. If these are hoaxes, whoever made them had a pretty sophisticated understanding of modern surgery, or they were copying from a medical textbook. That's the accusation, that the stones are folk art, created in the 20th century by clever artisans who looked at books, magazines, encyclopedias, and translated those images into stone. It's plausible. It fits the evidence. And yet, when you look at the sheer number of stones, the consistency and style, the effort involved in creating 15,000 fake artifacts just to sell to one eccentric doctor, it starts to feel excessive. The Peruvian government considers the Ica stones a closed case. Academia dismisses them. Museums won't touch them, but collectors still buy them. Tourists still visit Cabrera's museum, and every so often, someone pulls another engraved stone out of the ground near Ica. No one's quite sure what to do with it. New Mexico, Hidden Canyon, about 35 miles south of Albuquerque. At the base of a mesa, there's a boulder. It's big, roughly 80 tons of basalt, dark and weathered. And carved into its face are letters, ancient letters, Paleo-Hebrew, to be specific. The same script used in the Levant around 500 BC, maybe earlier. And those letters spell out something very particular. The Ten Commandments in New Mexico. The stone was first documented in 1933 by a local archaeologist named Frank Hibben. He was a grad student at the time, exploring the area, and a guide showed him the boulder. Hibben didn't think much of it initially. There are a lot of carved rocks in the southwest, petroglyphs left by Native American tribes, historical graffiti, modern vandalism. But when he looked closer at the script, he realized this wasn't any of those things. This was Hebrew, Old Hebrew, and it was sitting in the middle of the New Mexico desert. He didn't publish his findings right away, partly because he was young, still establishing his career, and partly because he knew what kind of reaction it would get. When he finally did bring it to wider attention in the 1950s, the response was exactly what he expected: skepticism, dismissal, accusations of fraud. Because here's the problem. If the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is genuine, it means Semitic people were in North America over 2,000 years before Columbus. And that rewrites everything. The inscription itself is a version of the Ten Commandments, written in an ancient Hebrew script that predates the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not a perfect match to the biblical text. There are variations, abbreviations, some letters that are worn or ambiguous, but it's recognizable. Scholars who've examined it say the grammar and syntax are consistent with ancient Hebrew. It's not modern. It's not something you could fake easily unless you had serious expertise in Paleo-Hebrew paleography. And that's where the debate gets messy. The skeptics argue that the stone is a hoax, probably carved sometime in the 1800s by a settler with knowledge of Hebrew. There were Jewish immigrants in the Southwest during that period. Maybe one of them decided to leave a religious marker, a monument of sorts, and used an archaic script they'd studied. It's possible. There's a tradition among certain communities of creating memorial stones in remote places. But there are details that don't fit that narrative. First, the weathering. The grooves are old, not just surface-level scratches. They're deep, eroded by centuries of exposure to wind, rain, and temperature shifts. Geologists who've examined the stone estimate the inscriptions could be anywhere from 500 to 2,000 years old, based on the patina and erosion patterns. That doesn't prove antiquity. Weathering can be faked or misinterpreted, but it does complicate the hoax theory. Second, the location. Hidden Canyon isn't accessible. It wasn't near any major trails or settlements in the 1800s. If you were going to carve a hoax, you'd put it somewhere people might actually see it. This stone was hidden, obscured by vegetation, difficult to reach. It wasn't found until the 20th century, and even then, only because a local guide happened to know it was there. Third, there's the companion evidence. About 20 miles from Los Lunas, there's another site. Phoenician inscriptions carved into rock faces near the Rio Grande. Different script, same general time period, and scattered throughout the southwest, there are odd artifacts that suggest ancient Mediterranean contact. A Roman-style oil lamp found in a sealed cave in Arizona. Coins that might be Carthaginian, stone anchors off the California coast that resemble designs used by ancient seafarers. None of these are accepted by mainstream archaeology. They're dismissed as misidentifications, hoaxes, or coincidences. But taken together, they paint a picture that's hard to ignore. What if ancient mariners did reach the Americas? Not in large numbers, not establishing colonies, but in small, isolated expeditions that left traces behind. Traces we're only now starting to recognize. The theory isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. We know the Phoenicians were exceptional sailors. They circumnavigated Africa. They traded across the Mediterranean and beyond. If they could sail from Carthage to Britain, why not across the Atlantic? The currents are favorable. The distance, while significant, isn't impossible. And if a ship got blown off course, caught in a storm, separated from a fleet, it could end up on the coast of North America. Maybe someone survived. Maybe they traveled inland, following rivers, searching for a way home. And maybe, at some point, they stopped at the base of a mesa in what would one day be called New Mexico and carved their faith into stone. A message, a prayer, a reminder that even here, in this strange and distant land, the covenant still mattered. There are places on Earth where stone speaks in a language we've forgotten, ancient walls that shouldn't exist, towers that tracked celestial movements thousands of years before we thought anyone could, jars large enough to hold human bodies, scattered across remote hillsides with no explanation. These aren't the famous monuments you've seen in textbooks. These are the structures that archaeologists argue about late into the night, the ones that don't fit neatly into our understanding of human development. Some were built by cultures we can barely name. Others predate written history entirely, and all of them hold secrets that modern science is only beginning to decode. Tonight, we're traveling to 9 of the most mysterious prehistoric sites on the planet. Places where the past refuses to stay buried and where every answer leads to 3 more questions. The Kaimanawa Forest, deep in the heart of New Zealand's North Island, stretches across nearly 200 square miles of volcanic terrain and dense, tangled wilderness. From above, it looks untouched, primeval, a place where nature has always ruled. But hidden beneath layers of moss, roots, and shadow, something lies that doesn't quite belong. In 1996, a forester named Barry Brailsford was moving through one of the most remote sections of the forest when he noticed something that stopped him cold. Ahead of him, partially buried in the slope of a low embankment, were stone blocks, large ones, flat-faced, carefully aligned. They weren't scattered. They weren't broken. They formed what looked unmistakably like a wall. The structure ran for roughly 30 feet. Each stone measured between 3 and 6 feet in length. The faces were smooth, the edges sharply defined. The stones sat together with a precision that suggested planning, not chance. This was not how random rock formations usually appear. And that's where the problem begins. According to established history, the Maori people arrived in New Zealand around the 13th century. They were exceptional navigators, skilled engineers, and deeply connected to the land. But their construction traditions relied on wood, earthworks, and carved timber. Stone walls cut, shaped, and fitted, were not part of their known architectural practices. So if the Maori didn't build it, who did? For nearly 30 years, the Kaimanawa Wall has divided opinion. Brailsford and others argue the stones show clear signs of human workmanship. The angles are too consistent, the surfaces too evenly finished. They point to grooves and markings on the stone faces that appear intentional, suggesting tools were used to shape them. But many geologists see it very differently. Mainstream archaeology maintains that the wall is entirely natural. The region sits on volcanic rock, and under certain conditions, cooling lava fractures into straight-edged geometric forms, a process known as columnar jointing. The famous basalt columns of Ireland's Giant's Causeway are often cited as an example. According to this explanation, erosion, soil movement, and vegetation growth created an illusion of construction where none exists. At first glance, it's a convincing argument, but the story doesn't end there. In 2005, researcher Michael Coote conducted a closer examination of the site. He documented what appeared to be multiple horizontal courses of stone, arranged in layers. This stacking pattern, he argued, was difficult to reconcile with random geological fracturing. Even more intriguing, he identified material between some of the stones that resembled mortar. Laboratory testing, however, failed to provide a definitive answer. The samples could not be conclusively dated or identified. The New Zealand government has taken a cautious approach. The site has never been officially classified as an archaeological monument. No protective measures have been put in place. Over time, the forest has quietly reclaimed it. Moss blankets the stone faces. Tree roots push between the gaps. In some places, saplings grow directly through the structure itself. What makes the Kaimanawa Wall especially puzzling is its isolation. If it were built by humans, it represents an architectural tradition unlike anything else in New Zealand. There are no nearby structures, no evidence of quarries, no discarded stone fragments, no tools, no settlements, just a single wall, standing alone in the forest. That absence has fueled more controversial theories. Some researchers suggest the wall may predate the Maori entirely, built by an unknown culture that reached New Zealand long before recorded history. Polynesian oral traditions occasionally mention earlier inhabitants, shadowy figures who lived on the land before the ancestors arrived. These stories are fragmented, symbolic, and difficult to interpret, but they persist. Others have gone further, pointing to similarities between the Kaimanawa stones and ancient masonry in South America. In places like Peru and Bolivia, builders shaped massive stones to fit together without mortar, achieving astonishing precision. Could ancient mariners have crossed the Pacific long before we believe possible? It's a speculative idea, and one most scholars reject, but it cannot be completely ruled out. What we are left with is uncertainty. The formation displays features that challenge a purely geological explanation, yet it lacks the cultural context needed to confidently label it human-made. No tools, no artifacts, no dates, just stone. And stone, as we know, doesn't speak easily. Today, the wall remains largely forgotten. Occasionally, a researcher or hiker makes the long journey to see it. They measure the blocks, photograph the angles, debate the evidence. Then they leave, and the forest closes in once more. If the Kaimanawa Wall is natural, it stands as one of the most remarkable coincidences of geology in the Pacific. If it is artificial, it forces us to reconsider who reached New Zealand, and when. Either way, it reminds us of something deeper. Our understanding of the past is incomplete. Landscapes remember more than we do. And sometimes, the most important questions are the ones we don't yet have the tools to answer. As the years pass, the forest grows thicker, the stones fade further from view, and with every season, the chance to uncover the truth grows just a little smaller. It implies years, perhaps generations, of observation. Someone stood here at dawn, day after day, noting the sun's position. Someone recorded the pattern. Someone recognized its repetition. And eventually, someone translated that understanding into architecture that could outlast human memory. What continues to astonish researchers is how unique Chankillo is. Other ancient cultures track the sun, Stonehenge, Newgrange, the Egyptian temples, but none use a linear tower system quite like this. Chankillo represents an independent solution to the same cosmic question: how do we measure time by the sky? There are still mysteries that remain unresolved. We don't know how the calendar structured daily life. We don't know which ceremonies accompanied solstices or equinoxes. We don't know why the site was abandoned, or what forces caused its people to leave the valley behind. Recent discoveries have added new layers to the story. In 2021, archaeologists identified ancient roadways linking Chankillo to surrounding settlements. These roads suggest the site served not just a single community, but an entire region. The solar towers may have coordinated planting seasons, festivals, and rituals across multiple villages, a shared cosmic reference point in a harsh landscape. Today, Chankillo is protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Few visitors make the journey. The desert is remote. The heat is relentless. But those who stand among the towers at sunrise often describe the same sensation: a quiet awareness of deep time. The people who built Chankillo are gone. Their names are lost. Their language has vanished, but their understanding remains. Every year, the sun still rises and sets exactly where they predicted it would. That is their legacy, not carved into texts or dynasties, but written into the movement of the sky itself. And even now, more than 2,000 years later, we are still learning how much they truly knew. Along the coast of Peru, the desert stretches for hundreds of miles. It is one of the driest regions on Earth. Years can pass without measurable rainfall. The ground is hard, pale, and unforgiving. At first glance, it feels like a place where human life should never have taken hold. And yet, more than 2,000 years ago, people not only survived here, they observed the sky with extraordinary precision. Chankillo lies in the Casma-Sechin Valley, roughly 230 miles north of modern-day Lima. The site spreads across nearly 2 square miles of desert terrain. Scattered across this landscape are plazas, temples, and fortified structures. But rising above all of it, running along a low ridge from north to south, stands the feature that has drawn global attention: 13 stone towers, aligned in a long, deliberate row. From a distance, the towers appear modest: weathered stone, uneven silhouettes, ruins shaped by centuries of wind and heat. But appearances are deceptive. These towers form one of the earliest and most precise solar observatories ever discovered. The system works with elegant simplicity. From a designated observation point to the west, an observer watches the sunrise. Over the course of the year, the sun appears to rise at different positions along the horizon. At Chankillo, those positions align almost perfectly with the gaps between the towers. During the summer solstice, the sun rises at one extreme end of the line. At the winter solstice, it rises at the opposite end. Day by day, it shifts steadily from one tower to the next. The same process occurs at sunset, viewed from the eastern observation point. Together, the towers track the sun's annual journey with remarkable accuracy, within 2 or 3 days of modern astronomical calculations. This is not symbolic alignment. This is functional science, built in stone, centuries before the rise of the Inca Empire. We do not know the name of the people who built Chanquillo. The culture that occupied this valley around the 4th century BCE left no written records. What remains are ceramics, textiles, and architectural clues, enough to tell us they were organized, deeply ritualistic, and highly attentive to their environment. In a desert like this, timing meant survival. Agriculture depended on scarce water sources and narrow seasonal windows. Plant too early, and seeds would fail. Too late, and harvests would be lost. A precise solar calendar wasn't a luxury, it was essential. But Chanquillo was never just a calendar. Nearby, on a hill overlooking the towers, stands a fortified temple complex. 3 concentric stone walls surround it, creating a stronghold that feels both defensive and ceremonial. Inside, archaeologists uncovered evidence of ritual fires, offerings, and elevated platforms, likely used for observation or ceremony. This was a place where the movement of the sun was tied directly to belief, authority, and communal life. The towers themselves vary in height, ranging from roughly 6 to 15 feet. They are constructed from local stone and adobe, materials readily available in the valley. Their orientation is deliberate, their spacing precise. Whoever designed this system understood solar declination, horizon variation, and the cyclical nature of celestial motion. That knowledge did not appear overnight. The hills of Assam rise gently across northeastern India, blanketed in thick jungle and endless tea plantations. The air is heavy with moisture. Insects hum constantly. Birds call from the canopy. It feels like a landscape shaped entirely by nature. And then, without warning, stone appears. Scattered across these hills, sometimes in small clusters, sometimes spread wide apart, stand hundreds of massive stone jars. They seem out of place, too deliberate, too heavy, too silent. Some of them reach nearly 10 feet in height and span more than 8 feet across. Each weighs several tons. They are carved from single blocks of sandstone, hollowed with remarkable effort. Most are cylindrical, slightly tapered, with wide circular openings at the top. A few still have carved lids, now cracked or resting nearby. Centuries of monsoon rain have roughened their surfaces. Lichen coats the stone. In several cases, trees have grown up through the jars themselves, slowly forcing them apart. No one knows who made them or why. Local communities have lived alongside these jars for generations. They have names for them in different dialects. Some stories claim they were made by giants. Others say they belong to ancient kings who used them to store grain or rice beer. These explanations were passed down, repeated, and accepted, but never tested. For a long time, archaeologists largely ignored the jars. The first detailed documentation came in the 1920s, when British colonial officers recorded several jar sites during surveying expeditions. They noticed an immediate resemblance to the Plain of Jars in Laos, where thousands of similar stone vessels dot the landscape. But Assam was remote, difficult to reach, and overshadowed by more famous archaeological sites across India. The jars were noted, filed away, and forgotten. That began to change in the early 2000s, when systematic research finally began. What archaeologists discovered only deepened the mystery. Based on soil analysis and associated artifacts, the jars likely date to around 2,000 years ago during the late Iron Age. Precise dating is nearly impossible. Stone contains no organic material, so researchers must rely on indirect clues, pottery fragments, burial goods, and sediment layers found nearby. But one detail stands out immediately. There are no quarries nearby. The sandstone used to carve the jars does not match the surrounding geology. The stone had to be transported, possibly over several miles of dense jungle and uneven hills. Moving blocks weighing multiple tons through this terrain would have required planning, labor, and social organization on a significant scale, which raises the obvious question: why? One widely accepted theory suggests the jars were used in burial practices. At several sites, archaeologists uncovered human remains near the jars, along with beads, tools, and pottery fragments. This aligns with known traditions in Southeast Asia, where bodies were placed in containers during an initial stage of decomposition before the bones were cleaned and reburied. A secondary burial, marking a transition rather than an end. But the evidence is inconsistent. Many jars contain no human remains at all. Some are completely empty. Others show signs of burning, as if fires were lit inside them. That detail complicates the burial theory. What kind of funerary ritual involves lighting fires inside massive stone vessels? Another explanation points toward fermentation. In traditional Assamese culture, communal brewing of rice beer played an important social and ritual role. The size and shape of the jars would have been practical for large-scale fermentation. Festivals, seasonal gatherings, and religious ceremonies often revolved around shared drink. Could these jars be the ancient predecessors of that tradition? The problem is permanence. Wooden vats, clay pots, or woven containers would have been easier to produce and replace. Stone is different. It suggests intention, monumentality, and long-term significance. These jars were never meant to be temporary. Their distribution adds another layer of complexity. The jars are spread across multiple sites, separated by miles of difficult terrain. Some locations have only a handful, others contain dozens. One of the largest known sites includes more than 60 jars scattered across a hilltop, many now broken or toppled. There are no visible roads connecting these places, no carvings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate ownership or purpose. Recent excavations have revealed something unexpected. At several sites, the jars are associated with carefully built stone platforms, flat surfaces made from fitted slabs. The jars are placed on or beside these platforms, suggesting they were part of a larger architectural design. These were not random placements. They were planned. This points toward ritual. The jars may have served as focal points for ceremonies now lost to time. The platforms could have functioned as stages for offerings, gatherings, or rites that combined fire, burial, and communal participation. Without written records, the meaning remains out of reach. What makes the situation more urgent is how quickly the jars are disappearing. Some have been damaged by treasure hunters, convinced they contained gold. Others were destroyed by farmers clearing land. Many have simply collapsed, weakened by centuries of rain and heat. Protection efforts exist, but enforcement in such remote areas is difficult. There is now a race against time. Archaeologists are trying to document what remains before it vanishes. Funding is limited. Access is difficult. Progress is slow. And with every jar lost, another piece of the story disappears. The jars of Assam are not isolated. They are part of a broader megalithic tradition stretching across Southeast Asia, from India to Laos to Indonesia. Understanding them could change how we see ancient migration, trade, and cultural exchange. For now, they remain silent, stone vessels in a living jungle, holding knowledge we can sense but not yet reach. The northern highlands of Ethiopia rise abruptly from the surrounding lowlands, a land of steep escarpments, volcanic plateaus, and thin mountain air. This is ancient ground. Some of the oldest continuous human settlements on Earth took root here, and hidden beneath these highlands are stone monuments that predate one of Africa's most powerful early civilizations. Axum, also known as Axum, is famous for its towering stone stelae. These massive obelisks once marked the graves of kings and nobles during the height of the Aksumite Empire, between roughly 100 and 940 A.D., carved from single blocks of granite, some rising over 70 feet tall. The stelae are astonishing feats of engineering. Their surfaces are carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and windows, frozen in stone. But long before the Aksumite Empire rose to power, something else was already happening here. Beneath the Aksumite layers, sometimes literally beneath them, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of an earlier tradition of stone construction. These older structures are known as proto-megaliths, stone platforms, upright pillars, and shaped boulders dating from roughly 1000 to 400 BC. They were built centuries before Axum became a regional force. Compared to the later stelae, these proto-megaliths appear crude. The stones are less refined, the shapes simpler. There is little decorative detail, but they matter deeply because they represent the beginning of a monumental tradition that would eventually define Ethiopian civilization. These structures came to light during excavations in the 1970s and 1980s. Archaeologists working beneath known Aksumite ruins encountered older occupation layers. As they dug deeper, the architecture changed. Masonry became simpler. Stone blocks were less precisely cut. Radiocarbon dating of nearby materials pushed the timeline back by several centuries. The people who built these early monuments left no written records. We do not know their names, their language, or how they understood themselves. What we do know is that they farmed, traded with neighboring regions, and possessed the organizational capacity to move and place large stones deliberately. The most common interpretation is funerary. Many proto-megalithic platforms are associated with burials. Excavations have uncovered human remains beneath or near these stones, along with pottery, jewelry, and tools. The stones appear to mark important individuals, people of status, authority, or ritual significance. By placing stone, rather than wood or earth, over the dead, these communities created something permanent, something meant to endure. That permanence tells us a great deal. Moving stone requires coordination. Labor must be organized. Food must be provided. Decisions must be made about who deserves such markers. All of this implies social hierarchy and emerging political complexity. These were not small, loosely connected groups. They were structured societies beginning to express power through the landscape. Location matters as well. Many proto-megaliths are positioned on hilltops or ridgelines, places with commanding views of surrounding valleys. These stones were meant to be seen. They were statements, markers of territory, authority, and memory. Long before Aksum's giant stelae dominated the skyline, these earlier monuments were already shaping how power was displayed in stone. But the story isn't entirely straightforward. Not all proto-megaliths are linked to burials. At sites such as Beta Georgis, archaeologists found stone platforms and standing pillars with no associated graves. The arrangement suggests ceremonial use. Some stones resemble altars or offering tables. Others appear positioned to structure movement and gathering. What took place there is unknown. Seasonal rituals, religious ceremonies, political assemblies. Without inscriptions or imagery, archaeologists must read meaning from spatial relationships and architectural patterns alone. Stone becomes the language, and interpretation is careful, cautious, incomplete. What makes these proto-megaliths especially important is their place within a broader African context. Across the continent, different societies independently developed megalithic traditions, from the stone circles of Senegambia to the pillars of southern Ethiopia. Each tradition is unique, yet they share a common impulse: the use of stone to create permanence, memory, and connection between the living, the dead, and the sacred. In Ethiopia, the proto-megaliths represent the earliest chapter of that story. Over generations, techniques improved. Stones were shaped more precisely. Construction became more ambitious. By the time the Aksumite Empire emerged, the knowledge required to carve and erect massive stelae already existed. The empire did not invent monumental stone architecture. It inherited and perfected it. There are still unanswered questions. Archaeologists debate whether there was continuous development from proto-megaliths to Aksumite stelae, or whether there were breaks, periods of decline, or cultural transition. The archaeological record is incomplete, fragmented by time and circumstance. Preservation is another challenge. Ethiopia has endured decades of political instability and economic hardship. Many proto-megalithic sites remain unexcavated. Others have been damaged by agriculture, construction, or neglect. Some stones barely rise above the ground, unnoticed and unprotected, and yet they are foundational. Without these early monuments, there would be no great stelae of Aksum, no towering symbols of imperial authority carved into granite. The proto-megaliths are the origin point, the first attempt to make ideas permanent in stone. They remind us that every civilization begins modestly, with rough tools, with simple stones, with people willing to imagine something that might last longer than they would. And once those stones are gone, that beginning becomes much harder to see. Cornwall, at the southwestern edge of England, is a landscape shaped as much by story as by stone. Ancient Celtic traditions cling to the hills and valleys, carried in place names, folklore, and weathered monuments. Across the moorlands, standing stones and burial chambers rise from the earth, reminders of communities who shaped this land thousands of years ago. Among them is a site both familiar and misunderstood: Menantol. The name translates simply as Stone of the Hole. Most visitors recognize the central feature immediately: a circular granite slab, roughly 4 feet across, pierced by a perfectly round opening. It stands upright, flanked by 2 smaller standing stones. The trio is instantly recognizable, photographed endlessly, and often treated as a complete monument. But it isn't. Scattered around the famous stones are others, smaller, less dramatic and frequently overlooked. Archaeologists refer to them as the lesser stones. Some lie half-buried in the turf. Others have fallen, shifted, or been displaced over centuries. A few show signs of deliberate shaping, flattened faces, angled edges, subtle indications of human work. Together they suggest that Menontal was once part of a much larger and more complex structure. The difficulty is knowing what that structure looked like. Menontal has been known for centuries, but careful archaeological study came late. By the time researchers began serious documentation in the 20th century, the site had already been altered. Stones were removed for building material. Treasure seekers dug around the monument. Victorian visitors rearranged rocks to create more pleasing compositions. What remains today may be only a fragment of the original design. The whole stone itself raises questions. Perfectly circular holes cut through solid granite are rare in prehistoric Britain. Creating one would have required time, skill, and precision. The builders likely worked from both sides, slowly pecking away at the stone. Any miscalculation could have cracked the slab beyond use. The effort suggests intention and significance. So why do it? Local folklore provides one answer. For generations, the whole stone was believed to have healing powers. Sick children were passed through the opening to cure illness. Adults crawled through it to ease joint pain or back trouble, always moving in a specific direction, following the sun. These practices continued into the 19th century, and even today, some visitors repeat them as tradition. But folklore reflects later belief, not original purpose. Most archaeologists agree that the healing rituals likely developed long after the stone was erected. Attempts by later communities to explain a monument already ancient and mysterious. The original meaning lies further back in time. One theory places Menontal within a Bronze Age funerary landscape. The surrounding area is dotted with cairns and burial mounds. The whole stone may have marked a ritual threshold, a symbolic passage between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Passing through the stone could have represented transition, renewal, or rebirth. Another possibility involves astronomy. Researchers have examined whether the stones align with solar or lunar events. Some measurements suggest potential connections to solstices or significant risings, but the evidence remains uncertain. The alignments are suggestive, not precise. Whether intentional or coincidental remains open to debate. The lesser stones complicate everything. If Menontal was once part of a larger arrangement, a stone circle, an avenue, or a ceremonial pathway, then focusing on the three central stones alone misses the point. Meaning would have emerged from the full layout, the spacing, the movement through the site, the relationship between stones and landscape. In 2005, a ground-penetrating radar survey added weight to this idea. Beneath the surface, researchers detected anomalies consistent with stone sockets, places where additional megaliths may once have stood. The visible stones are survivors, not the whole story. Large-scale excavation is unlikely. Menontal is a protected monument, and funding for extensive archaeological work in Cornwall is limited. Without immediate threats, the lesser stones remain undisturbed, their context preserved by inaction. What we have then are fragments, three iconic stones, removed from their original complexity, lesser stones that rarely appear in guidebooks, and a landscape that has changed dramatically over 4,000 years. Farming, mining, and shifting vegetation have altered the moor. Even the granite itself has weathered, its surface softened by centuries of wind and rain. And yet, Menontoll endures. Visitors continue to make the walk across the moor, often surprised by the monument's simplicity. There are no signs, no visitor center, just stone and sky. You can touch the granite, look through the holed stone, and see the Cornish hills framed in ancient rock. The lesser stones reward closer attention. They hint at complexity, at a sacred landscape woven into broader networks of belief and trade. Bronze Age Cornwall was not isolated. Tin from these hills traveled across Europe. Ideas moved with it. Rituals, symbols, architectural traditions. Menontoll belongs to that wider world. Its holed stone has parallels in Ireland and Scotland, rare monuments that suggest shared concepts across the Atlantic coast. Many were destroyed. Menontoll survived, perhaps because of its remoteness, perhaps by chance. Empires came and went, languages changed, religions replaced one another, the stones remained. And they still do, quiet, patient, holding meaning we can sense, but never fully recover. The Vale of Glamorgan, in southern Wales, unfolds like a gentle painting. Rolling green fields, hedgerows lining narrow lanes, small villages tucked into the countryside. It doesn't immediately suggest a place where giants once walked. Yet, local legend whispers otherwise, and here, near the village of St. Nicholas, lies something that gives those stories weight. Tinkinswood is a Neolithic burial chamber, one of Britain's largest. Its capstone alone weighs around 40 tons. Measuring roughly 24 feet long and 15 feet wide, it rests atop upright stones, forming a chamber that once held the remains of dozens of people. 40 tons. That's the weight of 8 adult elephants. The stone is old red sandstone, quarried from somewhere nearby, though exactly where remains a mystery. Moving it would have demanded extraordinary effort. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of people, hauling it on sledges, rollers, using levers to inch it across the landscape. And then, the lifting. Somehow, this colossal slab was raised and positioned atop the supporting uprights. Did they construct earthen ramps, employ counterweights? We can speculate, but the truth is lost to time. The chamber dates to around 3000 BC, part of a Neolithic Britain in transition. Farming communities settling, building monuments requiring coordination, planning, and specialized knowledge. Tinkinswood's scale implies more than a family effort. It speaks to community organization. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed at least 50 individuals, perhaps more, their bones disarticulated, scattered across the chamber. This suggests repeated use over centuries. Bodies were likely placed, left to decompose, and then moved to make space for new burials. Such collective interment was common in Neolithic Britain, but Tinkinswood's size is exceptional. Who were these people? DNA analysis wasn't available during the first excavations, and many remains have since been lost or damaged. But studies of similar populations suggest extended family groups, communities bound by kinship and shared identity. Burial here was probably a privilege reserved for certain lineages or individuals of status. The effort invested speaks volumes. The dead were not merely laid to rest, they were honored. The monument asserted permanence, announcing to anyone passing through the landscape that a community once thrived here. Tinkinswood is more than a tomb. A forecourt, semicircular and defined by upright stones, lies before the entrance. It hints at ritual, ceremonies marking deaths, perhaps annual remembrances or seasonal gatherings. The stones, though smaller than the capstone, still weigh hundreds of pounds, deliberately arranged to separate everyday life from the sacred. Walking that forecourt 5,000 years ago would have been profound, a crossing from the world of the living into a space devoted to memory and the dead. Time has changed the site. The chamber is partially collapsed, uprights shifted or fallen, the capstone tilting. Grass and moss blanket the stones. Trees encroach, softening the edges. Yet even in ruin, Tinkinswood is awe-inspiring. Standing beside the capstone, one feels the scale of human ambition, the ingenuity of people without engines or written instructions who moved and raised a 40-ton stone. It's humbling. Questions arise. Who coordinated the work? How were decisions made on design, placement, timing? Without writing, the Neolithic builders relied on oral communication, authority, and obligation, leaving us to infer organization from the monument itself. Some archaeologists argue the construction process was as significant as the tomb's purpose, binding communities together through shared labor, memory, and storytelling. Evidence suggests Tinkinswood had multiple functions. Pottery, flint tools, and animal bones indicate feasting or offerings over centuries. Even after the original builders faded, the site retained significance. By the Bronze Age, the original purpose may have been forgotten, but the chamber remained sacred, incorporated into new cultural practices. Welsh folklore later wove Tinkinswood into tales of giants and fairies. One legend claims women who spend the night before May Day, St. John's, or St. David's Day there, face death, madness, or sudden poetic inspiration. Strange as it sounds, it preserves a kernel of truth. Tinkinswood was special, commanding respect and caution long after its builders vanished. Modern preservation faces challenges. Weathering continues to erode the stone. The uprights bear immense pressure, risking collapse. Archaeologists monitor the site carefully, debating whether to intervene with modern stabilization or let nature follow its course. Each choice has trade-offs: safety and longevity versus authenticity and historical integrity. Today, visitors can walk the short path from the parking area, cross a stile into the field, and approach the chamber. No fee, no tour, just an ancient monument, still commanding the landscape. Standing there, the gulf between now and 5,000 years ago is palpable. People without electricity, engines, or written language built something monumental, enduring, permanent. The capstone still balances, a silent witness to ingenuity and collective effort. The bones are gone, but the monument endures, a testament not to individuals, but to the community, the culture, and a moment in human history when people looked at a 40-ton stone and decided, we can move it, we can lift it, we can make it last. And indeed, they were right. Brittany, on France's northwest coast, is the heartland of megaliths. Across the landscape, stones rise from fields and forests, dolmens, tumuli, long alignments of standing stones stretching for miles. In Neolithic times, this region was alive with communities devoting immense labor and skill to monuments that still dominate the terrain today. Most visitors know the Karnak stones, thousands of menhirs arranged in long parallel rows. Walking among them, it's easy to feel dwarfed by their scale and to wonder how these stones got here at all. Yet 8 miles from Karnak, in Loch Mariaca, stands, or once stood, something even more remarkable. At least, the fragments that remain hint at what was once the greatest megalith ever erected in Europe, the Grand Menhir Brisé, the Great Broken Menhir. Today it lies in four enormous pieces, toppled and shattered, scattered where it fell. But when intact, it soared roughly 67 feet into the sky, weighing an estimated 280 tons. That's more than 40 elephants, nearly 50 cars. The stone itself is orthonious granite, sourced about 6 miles away, across hills, valleys, and a river. How Neolithic people moved a 280-ton stone that distance? We can theorize: sledges, rollers, thousands hauling ropes, perhaps temporary causeways, but the truth remains unknown. And then they raised it upright. Imagine balancing a 67-foot, 280-ton stone, embedding it deep enough to stand for centuries, all without modern machinery. The breakage tells us it stood. The fracture patterns show it fell from an upright position, not during transport. For hundreds of years, the Grand Menhir dominated the landscape, a marker, a monument, a statement visible for miles, unmatched anywhere in Europe. Why build something this enormous? Quarrying alone required months of labor, shaping, and preparation. Transport demanded hundreds of coordinated workers, and raising it, the most dangerous task, fraught with risk and technical challenge. The menhir is both engineering feat and cultural statement. One theory, proposed by Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who studied these sites in the mid-20th century, suggests it was part of a lunar observatory. Thom argued that its position aligned with the Moon's 18.6-year cycle of standstills. Observers could have used it to track lunar events with precision, with other tall stones forming a network of markers. Elegant, but impossible to confirm. The menhir is broken. Other stones have shifted or vanished, and the prehistoric landscape has changed dramatically over 6 millennia. Another explanation is symbolic. The sheer scale conveyed power. The community demonstrated technical skill, organization, and social cohesion. The stone was power made tangible, a monument to collective ambition, regardless of practical function. But why did it fall? Granite doesn't fail easily. Perhaps an earthquake nudged it over, though Brittany is not highly seismic. Perhaps a rival community deliberately toppled it. Or maybe a small miscalculation, an improperly dug socket, subtle ground shift, caused it to lean and collapse over time. Whatever the cause, it was never re-erected. That speaks volumes. Either the builders dispersed, lost the skill, or no longer saw the need to restore it. Locmaria-Caire is more than the Grand Menhir. Nearby lies the Table des Marchands, a passage tomb decorated with axes, cattle, and abstract carvings, and the Aigras tumulus, a massive mound covering multiple chambers. These sites were likely part of a larger ceremonial complex, connected by sight lines and symbolic relationships. The Grand Menhir may have served as a central anchor, visible for miles, with other stones forming an intricate network. Excavations reveal sockets of other missing stones, hints of an arrangement perhaps akin to a circle or alignment. The complex is incomplete now, a puzzle missing crucial pieces. We see fragments, and through them, glimpse the ambition of a vanished people. Today, French authorities protect the site. Visitors can walk among the broken menhir, touch fragments larger than most buildings, and imagine the 67-foot stone standing upright, a testament to Neolithic ingenuity. Even in ruin, it inspires awe. People without engines or metal tools accomplish the impossible. The Grand Menhir is a story of achievement and loss. Achievement because it shows what humans can accomplish with determination, coordination, and ingenuity. Loss, because that achievement fell, and knowledge was lost. And yet, its fragments endure, silent witnesses to a prehistoric world that dared to reach for the sky in stone. Brittany's megaliths are monuments to ambition. People looked at enormous stones and saw possibility. They envisioned monuments to last forever, statements carved in granite that no one could ignore. For thousands of years, they were right. Though the Grand Menhir lies broken, its story still resonates, a testament to human will and imagination. And when you stand among its pieces today, you confront a simple truth. They believed a stone could last forever. And in a way, it has. The northern coast of Brittany is rugged and windswept, shaped over millennia by Atlantic storms. Villages cling to rocky shorelines, harbors tucked into sheltered bays. And on a promontory overlooking the sea stands one of Europe's oldest and largest megalithic monuments, the cairn of Barnarnes. Most people have never heard of it. It lacks the fame of Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid, yet in age and scale, it rivals both. The cairn stretches roughly 240 feet long, 90 feet wide, and rises up to 30 feet high. Built from thousands of tons of carefully stacked stone, it contains 11 passage tombs. Chambers reach through narrow corridors, penetrating deep into the monument. Barnarnes is astonishingly old. Its first phase dates to around 4,800 BC, over 1,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids and 2,000 years before Stonehenge. Agriculture was just spreading across northwestern Europe. Communities were transitioning from hunting and gathering to farming, establishing permanent settlements. And amidst this transformation, they built Barnarnes. Construction came in two phases. The eastern end, first, with 5 passage tombs. Centuries later, 6 more chambers were added westward. Slight differences in stone and technique hint at evolving skills or perhaps different builders. Each passage is narrow, often just 3 feet wide, lined with upright slabs, roofed by massive capstones, some extending over 40 feet into the cairn. Moving through them today, you have to crouch or bend, feeling the confined weight of stone above, just as the builders would have intended. These chambers were for burial. Excavations uncovered human remains, many deteriorated beyond recognition, alongside pottery, stone tools, and decorative items. Multiple individuals occupied each chamber over time, suggesting collective burial practices similar to sites like Tinkinswood in Wales. Yet Barnarnes was more than a tomb. Its location is strategic, commanding sweeping views of the surrounding landscape and coastline. From the top, one can see for miles. This was a statement, not only marking the dead, but asserting the presence and power of the community. The cairn's construction reflects sophisticated engineering. Internal walls distribute weight, preventing collapse. Passages are aligned with precision, some perhaps oriented towards solar or stellar events, though evidence for astronomical purpose is debated. Capstones weighing several tons were placed deliberately, creating stable roofs that have lasted nearly 7 millennia. The exterior was originally faced with carefully selected stones, forming smooth surfaces, traces of which remain today. Consider the scale of organization required. No written instructions, no engines, no metal tools. This was a project spanning generations, requiring planning, labor coordination, and specialized knowledge. It demonstrates that the Neolithic revolution was about more than farming. It was about communities learning to work together on monumental projects. Who were these people? We know little. No writing, no visual records, only the monuments and the artifacts within them. Pottery styles connect them to other Neolithic cultures in Brittany. Stone tools are typical of the era. Their language, beliefs, stories, all lost. Barnini's nearly didn't survive the modern era. In the 1950s, quarrying threatened to destroy it. A construction company treated it as a convenient source of roadstone, hauling tons away before archaeologist P. R. Giot intervened. By then, part of the cairn had been damaged, but the exposure allowed detailed study of its construction. French authorities declared it protected, and restoration stabilized the structure, though modern interventions are distinguishable from the original stones. Today, visitors can explore Barnenez, walking around the cairn, climbing to the top, entering the passage tombs. You feel the presence of nearly 7,000 years of history. The passages are dark and cool, the stone weight palpable. Inside some chambers, carved decorations survive, spirals, zigzags, abstract shapes. These rare Neolithic carvings hint at symbolic or territorial meaning, though their exact significance remains a mystery. The promontory location overlooking the Atlantic may have held symbolic value. Westward-facing orientations in later European traditions often relate to death or the afterlife, though we must be cautious about projecting later beliefs onto Neolithic people. What we can say confidently is that Barnenez mattered. Generations returned, maintaining the cairn, burying their dead, keeping it central to ritual and social life. It was an institution as much as a monument. The cairn's survival is remarkable. Weather, erosion, and human activity have left it altered, yet intact. Many megalithic sites have vanished, destroyed by development or neglect. Barnenez survived by intervention and dedication, reminding us how fragile our archaeological heritage truly is. Standing there today, looking out over the Atlantic, you sense the Neolithic builders' presence, not as ghosts, but as echoes. Their monument endures, connecting us to a world nearly 7,000 years old. Through storms, centuries, and human upheaval, Barnenez remains a testament to ambition, ingenuity, and the human desire to leave a lasting mark. Even in its weathered and partially restored state, Barnenez speaks across millennia. The people who built it believed their work could endure forever, and in this sense, it has. Sardinia rises from the Mediterranean like a natural fortress. Rocky coastlines, rugged mountains, and interior landscapes that seem designed to resist invasion. Scattered across this island are thousands of stone structures, built by a civilization that thrived here for more than 1,000 years. The Nuragic civilization, named after its signature towers, the Nuragi, left a landscape dotted with stone monuments. Some Nuragi are simple, single towers, others are complex, multi-level fortifications with interior chambers and defensive walls. Archaeologists estimate that as many as 10,000 Nuragi once existed. Thousands still survive in varying states of preservation. But beyond the towers, there are other, less famous structures equally impressive: the sacred wells. These underground chambers, accessed by stone staircases, were built around natural springs. They demonstrate remarkable engineering, precision, and symbolic intent. Most sacred wells date to the Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 800 BC. They are found throughout Sardinia, often near nuraghi or settlements. Each follows a consistent design. A staircase descends into the earth, leading to a chamber surrounding a spring. The ceilings are corbelled vaults, stones layered gradually to form a dome without mortar or supporting arches. The walls are smooth, fitted carefully, and the water collects in a basin below, accessible to those who descend. Practically, these wells provided essential water in Sardinia's hot, dry climate. Protecting springs with stone structures ensured clean, reliable water. But their purpose was more than utilitarian. The architectural sophistication, the labor involved, and the care in design suggest sacred significance. Water was life-giving, and the wells were treated as holy spaces. Archaeological evidence supports this. Excavations at several wells have revealed offerings, bronze figurines, pottery, jewelry, even weapons. Some were placed directly into the water as gifts to deities or spirits associated with the spring. These deposits indicate ritual use and a deep spiritual relationship with water. The most famous example is the Santa Cristina well in central Sardinia. Its staircase descends about 25 feet underground, leading to a chamber built with carefully dressed basalt blocks. The corbelled vault rises above the water in a perfect circular dome. Its alignment is remarkable. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, sunlight reaches the water at the bottom. During the winter solstice, the full moon illuminates it. Such astronomical precision suggests that the nuragic people connected water, light, and seasonal cycles in their religious practice. Other sacred wells show similar alignments, though not all are as precise. Across the island, a shared understanding emerges. Earth, water, and sky were interconnected. Accessing water involved more than a physical descent. It was a ceremonial act linking humans to nature and the cosmos. The corbelled vaults are particularly impressive. Each stone had to be positioned with precision, angled to support the weight above, while gradually closing the dome. A single misstep could collapse the structure. Yet at Santa Cristina and other sites, these vaults have stood for over 3,000 years, purely by gravity and careful craftsmanship. This engineering rivals contemporary constructions elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The nuragic civilization itself remains enigmatic. They left no writing, and their language is unknown. Archaeology reveals their skill as metal workers and traders, interacting with Phoenicians, Greeks, and Etruscans. Yet the sacred wells are distinctively Sardinian, expressing a unique worldview, reverence for water, careful integration with the landscape, and celestial alignment. Some researchers have noted parallels with other Mediterranean cultures: Mycenaean corbelled vaults, Etruscan tombs, or megalithic structures in Western Europe. Whether this reflects shared knowledge, trade of ideas, or independent innovation is unclear. Sardinia was not isolated. Trade networks and cultural exchanges were active, and the nuragic people absorbed outside influences while maintaining their identity. The sacred wells remained significant long after the Bronze Age. Romans sometimes modified them. Christian communities later built churches nearby. Santa Cristina, for example, has a small medieval church above the well. Pilgrims still descend its ancient stairs to reach the water, continuing a tradition of reverence for more than 3,000 years. The foundations of the wells are critical. The lowest stones bear the greatest weight and pressure, chosen and positioned with extraordinary care. They support the chambers above through earthquakes, floods, and the slow grind of geological time. These foundations are often buried, unseen, but they are essential to the monument's survival, a testament to the neuralgic mastery of both stone and earth. Visiting a sacred well today, you feel that connection. The water flows as it did millennia ago. The stone chambers remain cool and still, carrying echoes of rituals, offerings, and the people who built them. Descending the steps, you sense the weight of history, the care of thousands of hands, the blending of practical need, spiritual devotion, and architectural ingenuity. These wells are more than archaeological sites. They are living links to a civilization long vanished but still speaking through stone, water, and light. They remind us that even in isolation, human communities have sought to understand their world, honor natural forces, and leave enduring marks that transcend time. The neuralgic sacred wells endure, silently yet powerfully, teaching us that engineering, ritual, and cosmic observation were intertwined in the imagination of ancient Sardinians. They remain a testimony to human skill and devotion, preserved underground for thousands of years, waiting for those willing to descend and listen. 9 sites, 9 mysteries, scattered across the globe, from New Zealand to Sardinia, from India to Wales. Each one is unique, yet all share a common thread: the human desire to create something enduring, to shape stone and earth into monuments that would outlast their makers by centuries, even millennia. We've walked among fallen giants, stepped into dark chambers, traced the alignments of towers that mark the sun with astonishing precision. We've seen jars large enough to hold human bodies and stones heavier than houses, placed with care and purpose. And yet one truth becomes clear. The past is not fully knowable. We can dig, measure, and study. We can analyze, date, and theorize. But no matter how advanced our tools, these sites leave us with more questions than answers. Who built the Kaimanawa Wall? What ceremonies took place at Chankilo's solar towers? Why did Bronze Age people scatter enormous jars across Assam? The answers may never come. The builders left no records, and the stones speak only in their arrangement, their scale, and their silent endurance. And perhaps that is what makes them so compelling. The mystery itself draws us in, reminding us how much has been lost between their time and ours. These monuments resist explanation, yet they reach across millennia to tell us something essential: human ambition, creativity, and the will to leave a mark on the world. If exploring these ancient mysteries has captured your imagination, take a moment to show your support. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue uncovering the stories hidden in stone, across the globe, and through time. Because even in their silence, these ancient structures still speak, and there's so much more waiting to be discovered.